Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta. Thank you for joining me today, and this is Consistent Preterism. That was a little AC/DC Hell's Bells, and I just figured that I would throw that in as the intro song. I haven't done intro music in quite some time, so it's long overdue, but I like to throw in intro music songs that rattle the heads of Christian wannabes. And because you usually get, or I usually get, I should say, these fundamentalist Christians who check out my page, or who might search something on YouTube and stumble upon my page thinking that it's something that it really isn't, and they listen to some of these teachings. And the funny thing is they'll listen to a teaching, listen to another teaching, then you see them start commenting, right, calling me a heretic and going to hell, and accusing me of all sorts of nonsense, right, just because they don't have a clue what they're talking about. But then you notice that they continuously listen. Like, I can't tell you how many people over the last, 16 months, 18 months, however long I've had this channel, have done that. They've criticized me and critiqued me, but then you notice that they're just following right along, right? They're listening to all the videos, they're commenting on them. Of course, they're negative comments, but they're sticking around. So what I like to do is I like to sometimes start off a video with such a blasphemous rock and roll song such as Hell's Bells, just to kind of give people a little punch in the gonads, if you will. But anyways, enough about Hell's Bells. Today I am going to be recording a response, if you will, to the second recording, or I should say, to the response from James Valliant, aka Creating Christ Theory, back towards Israel only. So if you're not familiar, I did a few weeks ago, I did a recording, a couple hour long recording on Israel only and how it eliminates the theories of creating Christ, right? When you understand that the New Testament is all about Israel's salvation, you can see that the theory that the Romans created this religion or this story or this tale just really doesn't make sense, right? So I put forth a response, and it was about 2 hours long. And then a couple of days after that, Derek had James Valliant back on the show, back on his show, and he sent sort of a response back to me, or back to Israel only, I should say. And so this is sort of addressing that. Now, first of all, I'll say Valiant's a cool guy. I always preface when I speak of him with that, because I really do feel that, like he's not a wannabe, number one, which helps for me. He is, an intelligent guy. He's a historian. Okay. So this isn't, just a schmuck Christian who is just yapping because he, just was taught something, right? Obviously this guy is an intelligent human. So I do respect him in that regard, okay? So I'm not going to bash him, okay? Although sometimes I do get sarcastic and I can be sort of a smartass. So if that happens, just understand that's who I am. It's nothing personal against anybody, okay? But so I did want to go ahead and say that. Now, same thing with Derek. I like Derek a lot. Matter of fact, I'm going to be on his show soon. He's going to have me on to kind of give a rundown of my view. And so, these guys are good people, right? I don't have anything against them. But what I do need to do is I do need to address a few things that I felt were either misrepresented or just not quite adding up, okay? And this is most likely, as I said in one of my recent audios, this is most likely going to be my last response or audio addressing the creating Christ theory, and the reason is like I said before, when you come out of mass confusion, okay, and you find something as clear as Israel only, okay. Now I know some people may say, well, it's not clear to me. Well, sorry, but it is to us, okay, because we're looking at this from a totally unbiased viewpoint. No bias whatsoever, and it's making perfect sense, okay? All the pieces are falling in line. That's the most important part. What is the story actually saying? And is it a cohesive story? Well, under the Israel-only paradigm, it sure as hell is. It's very cohesive. So I'm not going to leave the waters of clarity to step back into the muck of confusion, okay? And that's what I feel, unfortunately, the creating Christ theory is, okay? It's, and I was talking about this with Mike Barris when I was out in Cali last week, and we were just talking about how we've both given this creating Christ theory a fair shot, and many people have. And we've listened, and I mean, gosh, I've listened to probably 10 hours worth of this material right now on YouTube, okay? And even now, 10 hours in, I'm still struggling to understand the reasoning behind why the Romans would create this story, right? It just kind of seems to be fluctuating and bouncing around, and there's no real reason that's coming to the surface, right? Of course, they've presented reasons, but, obviously we've sort of, shot those down, and then they come back with some other sort of reasoning, and it just is not making sense, right? And I would consider myself a pretty logical guy, right? A pretty, usually when something makes sense, I can pick up on it, right? Like, for instance, when I came from futurism into partial preterism, that was quick. It was like, wow, all right, boom, this is logical, it makes sense, I'm in. Then a few weeks later, after discovering that partial preterism is just half-truth, I jumped over to full preterism because I understood, wow, this makes sense. Boom, I picked it up and I'm in. Then as I progressed forward, I saw that the Bible is all Israel only, and it made perfect sense to me. And it doesn't take long for me. When I see something and I start going in that direction, if it's making sense and I'm making sense of things that I couldn't make sense of prior, that's usually the direction that I go, because if the pieces are fitting, chances are that's the proper path, okay, that you need to head towards. So to wrap it up or sum it up, I would say that I am not the type of person who struggles when it comes to picking up logical, cohesive, sensical type arguments. Okay, I can get them. All right. So for me to not be able to really understand the purpose, right? And I'm not saying I don't understand what these guys are saying, right? I hear their arguments, but it just doesn't make sense to me, right? They're not strong enough arguments to make sense of a story that exalts Israel. Okay, in other words, they're claiming that the Romans created this, and the Flavians and the emperors, right? But yet all along, this is a story about a remnant of Israel who is saved through the midst of a period of tribulation that came upon their people. It's not about the Romans. It's not about bringing some ultimate religion to fruition and joining Jew and Gentile together for all eternity under some new religion and some new Messiah. No, it's not about that. It's about a remnant of the true Israel, the elect of God, the elect of Yahweh, being saved, brought through that tribulation period, and then at the end being exalted into heaven, where you see them at the end standing by the throne in their heavenly angelic bodies. That's what the story is about. So I don't want to get too far off topic here, but the point is that I just can't see it, okay? So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and kind of play his response or his reply on YouTube, and I have absolutely no notes, okay? I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going completely off the cuff here, all right? I have a pen and I have a blank paper in front of me in case something comes to mind while I'm talking, but I have absolutely zero notes. Normally, when I do a critique or a response to somebody, I like to kind of come into it semi-prepared, right? And that means basically going through their presentation, kind of making notes at different minute points as to what I want to talk about, and I have a bit of a guideline. But for this one, I just don't have it, okay? As those of you who listened to the audio from a couple days ago know, my original plan was to get into Chicago, where I am recording this, on my free day, which is today, and I was going to get here early. The flight was supposed to land here at 8:45 a.m. this morning. And I was to be at my hotel probably by, 9:30, 10 o'clock, somewhere in that range. Come to the hotel, work on this pretty much, all day, really. I had planned on listening to his presentation again, marking off the points that I wanted to speak about and the minutes so that we don't have to listen to the whole hour and 17 minutes of it. And then on top of that, all of my words. So this is going to be a 3-hour audio. I didn't want that, right? So my plan was to go through it, kind of dissect it, navigate and focus and streamline a little bit more as to what I wanted to talk about. Well, my plane sits on the tarmac this morning for literally, I shit you not, 3.5 hours. All right, so instead of departing at 7 a.m., we departed at probably 11:15. All right, now, obviously, it's a decent flight from the East Coast to Chicago. I think it's normally about 2.5 hours. But they were rerouting airplanes up through Canada, right? So now we went north of Chicago and kind of came down at it. So now my flight went from 2.5 to 3.5 hours. It was an hour extension on the flight time. So now here I am. I'm landing in Chicago at roughly, 2 o'clock, right, instead of 9 o'clock. So 5-hour difference. So needless to say, I didn't have really time. And what I tried to do is jump on Wi-Fi and actually listen to this during the flight. But unfortunately, my Wi-Fi up there doesn't always work as planned. And sure enough, this didn't allow me to listen to his video. YouTube is very spotty up there. Sometimes I get it and I can listen to a video straight through with no problems. Other times it won't even upload the video. It just keeps saying, please tap again or try again. And so eventually I got sick of trying and I was like, I'm not even going to bother, right? I'm just going to do it completely off the cuff. So that's my plan. Okay, I listened to this one time a few weeks ago or a couple weeks ago when he put it out. I noted mentally that there were things that needed to be stated and addressed. And I said, I'm going to come back to that. So I have no notes. But what I am going to try to do so that we don't have to listen to the entirety of the hour and 17 minutes plus whatever I say on top of that, right, which would easily put this at 3 hours. Which it still could end up being 3 hours, even though I do this, right? There's no telling how long this could go. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to kind of listen to his points, let him play so you hear him. And then when I feel like he's kind of just going on about the same sort of topic, I'm going to cut it. I'm going to offer up my thoughts and my remarks. And then what I'll probably do is quickly pause my recording and bounce the audio forward to his next point on his YouTube presentation. That way we're not sitting here for the entire presentation and then, I come along and give my spiel. So if you do want to listen to it, go ahead, go to Myth Vision Podcast. I think it's the third most recent video on the video page. And it's titled, hold on, I'll tell you right now. Creating Christ with James Valliant and Myth Vision, Response to Israel Only, Jason DaCosta. Okay, and I'll put the link in the comments of this video as well, so that way people will have it if you wanted to listen to the whole thing. But that's how I'm going to go about doing it, and I really hope it doesn't take 3 hours, but then again, I've said that before. So yeah, that's the plan. Now, one other quick thing I did want to say, there was a buffoon on the first, on that video that was shared on Myth Vision Podcast. There's a buffoon, okay? He's a clown. He's a conspiracy nut. The guy bounces off the wall from left to right to the next hottest thing, and he's all over the place, right? And he admits that he's an idiot. And everybody knows it, right? I mean, like Donald Trump said, he knows it, they know it, everybody knows it, right? So this buffoon stated that I don't do discussions or I don't do debates because I prefer to have a one-way dialogue with myself. That way nobody can disprove me. All right, well, that's just silly, okay? If you followed me, you know that every single argument that's come against Israel only, I've shredded to pieces, okay? This idiot seems to think that a debate is a better format for critiquing somebody's position than actually taking it and addressing point by point each point that they bring up. I mean, that's stupid, okay? Debates, in my opinion, are not profitable, okay? They're just two guys going by a format, abiding by rules, not able to address points because they're flinging, tons of points at each other in a set given space of time. And so by the time the next person comes up, he can't address anything that the person previously said. So you have all these points that just go untouched, right? Because it's obviously, kind of on the fly. So you're trying to write stuff down. It's just a mess, okay? And to my knowledge and my experience, debates have never really swayed anybody one way or the other. Even the people who, understand that the argument is solid, they would still rather just stick by their person's side, so debates are stupid. What I think is much more profitable is to take somebody's argument, to play it the way I do, to stop it at each point and to address why that point is wrong. Okay, and I've given everybody the opportunity to do that to me, okay? What you noticed with the presentation by Valliant, if you listen to mine first, is you notice that in my 2 hours of presentation, I must have given 500 different scriptural examples and reasons and passages and portions and linked them together. And I explained to you how it's one cohesive story from start to finish. I explained difficult passages. I explained how they fit into the Israel-only narrative. I linked passages together. I showed you how everything comes to the end right at the coming, which coincided with the destruction of Jerusalem. I did extensive work to use what is given in the Bible to prove my point and prove my case. okay? And I addressed his main points while doing that. So not only did I present my case and use a plethora of different scriptural examples to do so, but I also, during that, refuted his points, his core arguments, okay, and showed why it just cannot be. Well, if you listen to his reply to me, you'd see that he didn't do anything of the sort, okay? And instead, what he did is he sort of just talked about, well, Jason doesn't seem to understand. Instead of actually refuting what I said, he just presented sort of his own little side arguments. There was no refutation whatsoever of any of my points. None of the things that I said about the passages and how they applied were even touched, right? None of it, okay? And you notice that he's also not using very many scriptures, right? He's trying to explain to people what the Bible means, and he's not explaining what the Bible means. He's not putting it into context. He's not explaining why certain things are said. That's what I'm doing, okay? I'm actually using the book that we're talking about to show why it means what it does, okay? The other party is not doing that. The other party is focusing on outer things, right? All kinds of theories and hypothesis and different conspiracy arguments to try to prove what the Bible actually says, and looking very little at what it actually does say. So when you think about that and you look at what I presented in terms of the evidence inside of the Bible compared to what he presents as evidence from inside the Bible, it's on a whole different planet, right? There's no comparison. For every one passage that he offers up for his position, I offer up 100 for mine. So there's no comparison, okay? But if you're into conspiracy theories and nothing concrete and just throwing ideas around and hoping they stick, then sure, that's the view for you. And this bonehead who commented on that video, who said that I prefer, one-way conversations, he can go pound sand, okay? And he knows who he is. How you doing, sweetheart? He can go pound sand, or he can kick rocks, okay? And let's see, what was I going to say? So the debate, the debate argument is stupid, okay? I would much rather have somebody critique things. The other thing is that this buffoon doesn't understand my life, okay? He doesn't know my lifestyle. He doesn't know my schedule. He doesn't know the things that go on in my own personal life. And I'll give you an example of that. This buffoon says that, Jay always says he's so busy, he never has any time for things. He's the busiest guy I've ever known. Yeah, but the real reason is he doesn't want to sit down and chat. Well, that's not the real reason at all. If you've noticed and you followed me, you know that I do most of my recordings from my car while I'm driving. Okay, and when I do a recording at home, it's because my lovely girlfriend is on the road traveling for work. Okay, she travels as well. My lovely girlfriend, who actually, she's not my girlfriend anymore, she's my fiance. I better learn how to say that real quick. But my fiance is a Christian, right? She's a confused Christian, although she's not confused to the point that she studies, because she doesn't. She's one of the ones, and I love her to death, but I have to call a spade a spade. She's one of the ones who claims it, but doesn't invest any time or energy into it, besides maybe going to church when she feels like it. So, love her to death, right? And thankfully, none of it matters anyway. So it's just kind of like a side dish that I don't care. Like now that I know the truth, I don't care what people do. Like you can go to church, you can claim whatever you want. It's all nonsense, right? But, if I ever got on my laptop in my office and started talking about these things, she would be offended, she would be hurt. Because she comes from a family that's steeped in Christianity. Heck, her own mom owns a small bookstore, a futuristic, dispensationally driven bookstore that thrives off of selling John Hagee books and Benny Hinn books. And who's that Jewish guy who claims he's like some prophet? The guy with the beard that looks like a bunch of pubic hairs pasted on his face. He did the Shemitah, whatever the hell his name is. Jonathan Kahn, is it? I don't know. Anyways, the guy's a clown, right? He looks like an idiot. He looks like a guy who just glued a beard on and is trying to be a prophet. But like this is what she thrives on in that store. And I love her to death. Her mom's awesome. But they don't really know a lot, right? They're innocent and they don't care to really put in the energy like I do and like others do. So it's two totally different planets, right? So like if I were to do this around them, I'd get myself into trouble. All right, guys, you can feel me on that. Ladies, you may not. But the guys out there understand where I'm coming from on this, okay? Am I going to shoot myself in the foot and set myself up for the doghouse for weeks to come by jumping on and doing a debate or doing a discussion at the leisure of Valliant or Lambert, right? When I know what it's going to bring me on the back end? No, of course not. So I have to plan my steps accordingly, which is why I do a lot of these critiques from the road. Here I am in Chicago because I'm at peace. I'm doing my own thing. I don't have to answer to anybody, and I can do what I got to do, okay, without the repercussions coming down on me like the Undertaker, all right? So before you speak up and say that he's the busiest guy, he never has time for things, you should at least understand the situation that the person's coming from, all right? Because if you did, you wouldn't make such stupid comments. All right, so I just wanted to get that off my chest before we begin here. So we're going to get right into it, and we're going to start at about the 3-minute mark because the first few minutes is just music and just a quick introduction. And this is about the point where Derek introduces James Valliant, and then he talks about me, and he basically says that I.O. and Creating Christ has a lot in common, and that James and myself have a lot in common. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of let this roll a little bit. I may not stop it as much as I should, just because I want to kind of get moving on it, but I'm going to try to let him, speak some things, and as he's speaking, I'm going to try to write notes, and then I'm going to come back on and sort of cover a few things. So here he is, okay, at the 3-minute mark.
Because our friend Jason DaCosta, he made a long 2-hour interview where he discussed your view as well as some of his points. And man, I think a dialogue needs to take place because it's obvious that it's almost like if you're an IO person, you listen to DaCosta and you think that what DaCosta's saying means the opposite for Creating Christ because DaCosta's espousing his views. How much do you guys have in common? I mean, that is a place to start. Let's start on unity rather than getting to differences because it sounds like he's saying what you guys think in a lot of ways. And maybe we can get into definitions of what is Israel only, because I thought Israel only had to do with the genetic tribe descendants of Abraham, biological descendants of Abraham. And I know there are some out there who say that. So maybe we could touch on that, what DaCosta brought up in the interview. But go ahead and start where you have, because you're the one with the notes, and I'm here to host you.
First, I want to thank Jason DaCosta. I really do. He said some very kind things about me. I mean, very kind things about me and so forth at the end of his presentation. And he did give basically a 2-hour-long discussion of the Creating Christ theory. And I am both grateful for his kind words and even more grateful for the critical engagement because I agree with you. It is through discussion that we're going to learn, not through faith, but through rational discussion. And we're all going to learn, hopefully. We're each going to learn from each other if we have an open and rational discussion. And I'm very appreciative of the critical reaction even that he gave us. But you're right. We're kind of talking past each other. We agree about so much. And part of what's disturbing to me is there is something I need to disagree about. At the very end, he says, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I've misrepresented the position of Creating Christ. I have to break it to him. He has. He basically totally misunderstands our position. And one of the main differences is that he doesn't understand our similarities, how much we share.
Okay, let's do this, James. That's awesome. I'm glad you brought that up first because it sounds to me we really need to have dude, I'm telling you, I've talked to Jason. I've had conversations. The guy's a sharp guy. You look at
to criticize someone who's been so nice. Gave me such a detailed response.
Well, when you hear Rome, you keep hearing Rome. You keep hearing, Rome's involved, and you think Roman invention, right? What do they think? We think Caesar wrote the book, right? Or Creating Christ is saying Caesar wrote the book, and that is not a conception that you guys are espousing at all. However, I want to go ahead and correct a few things. It sounds to me when he saw a documentary about 12 months ago, he said, you guys don't even have a documentary out. So
there's a documentary about Atwell's book, and we have a lot of overlap, but we also have some very significant differences with Atwell. And what he saw was a documentary about Atwell, and he referred to it as a documentary about Creating Christ. So he was mistaken there, but that, was an innocent mistake.
One quick comment on that. That is an innocent mistake. I knew that they weren't related, right? I knew that the documentary that I had watched wasn't the James Valliant position, or I shouldn't say position, but wasn't made by James Valliant. And I think I believe, stated that in my presentation. But when you see this documentary matter of fact, one of my friends sent it to me. He was kind of looking at it and said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" This was a long time ago, at least a year ago. And I checked it out. I watched it. It was like 2 hours long. And I really kind of struggled to get through it because it just wasn't clear. And just everything about it just kind of irked me the wrong way, knowing what I knew. And now, a year later, I know way more. So now, Imagine me declining on it back then when I was just coming into all this stuff and putting things together, and now give me another year of tirelessly linking things and seeing how this is super clear now, and now I'm hearing it again. So it's just not going to sit right with me. But fair enough. I mean, if they have differences, that's fine. But the premise is still the same, right? It's both believe that it was sort of created by Rome, maybe not written by Rome, if I misrepresented that at all, but at least created by Rome to accomplish a certain agenda. So that's the core, I believe, that is the foundation, which they would have that at least much in common.
There are profound differences between us, and the documentary was not about creating Christ. But some of the differences are really clear. We don't think of the New Testament as basically a mockery of Judaism or a mockery of first century Judaism, but an attempt to create a sincere religion, to incorporate the best moral and theological and allegorical thinking at the time in the New Testament.
Okay, so now he says that he believes, his version is that the New Testament was written or created to sort of attempt to establish a new religion or a new way of thinking or a new allegorical way of thinking and such. So, but again, what I proved in my presentation and what I've been proving on my channel is that no, it is not. The New Testament is not creating a new religion. That's what Christianity believes. That's what full preterism teaches, okay? That's not what Israel only teaches, because that's not what the Bible teaches, okay? The New Testament is, again, it's a mission, okay? It's not a religion. Let me stress this point, because I'm going to keep coming back to this, okay? And this is such a tremendously important thing to pick up on. The New Testament is not a new religion, okay? It wasn't created for a new religion. It wasn't created to start some kind of new messianic age or religion where people would believe in Jesus and receive remission of sins. No, the New Testament is a detailed account of a mission, okay, which also contains letters that were written between people that were involved in that mission. And these letters and these accounts are all detailed accounts and specifically written and addressed letters to people who were living during the time of that mission. And as Jesus said in the beginning, in the onset of that mission, he said, "Go and preach this to all nations, and then the end will come." He said his gospel would go to all nations, and then the end would come. Matthew 24:14 or Matthew 24:13. So that is set out from the beginning. And there's only one end in Scripture. We're going to get to this a little later on, because one of his key arguments is that, if I can't prove that there's only one end in Scripture, then my argument fails. Well, obviously that's all I can prove, and that's all I've been proving, is that the New Testament speaks of one final end, one final coming, one final end, one final resurrection, one final destruction, and it all coincides with the destruction of Jerusalem, which was the end of the age. Okay, that was the end of it all. All right, so what you have to understand is that the New Testament is about a mission. It's not a religion. It's not a new religion. It's about a mission, okay? And that mission was to go out and seek the elect from the four winds of the earth. From the four corners of the earth, they were to go out, preach this good news, his sheep would hear his voice and come. And that was what was going on, okay? So it was a mission to seek the elect. And at the end of the story, okay, when the Savior comes for them, the firstborn of the brethren returns for the rest of the brethren at his coming, which, by the way, was going to occur in that generation and before some standing there died, right out of his own mouth. That was the point when the mission would be fulfilled and all Israel would be saved. That was the point when all the elect would be gathered in, and every last one would be saved, sealed, and taken to heaven. And no, let me repeat, I'm not arguing that this story is true factual history. Okay, am I open to it? Sure, because, you're always going to have a little bit of an open window on that because nobody can disprove it, right? But I'm not dogmatic about that in any stretch of the word, right? I'm actually more open to the myth view myself. So we do have some of that in common. But again, this is not a new religion, okay? The New Testament is not a new religion. It's a mission, and that mission was complete by the coming of the Redeemer, which coincided with the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the age, the end of the law, the end of the sacrifices, the end of everything. Okay, so remember that. It was not created to create a new religion. And that's all I've ever been teaching. That's all I've ever proven. And that's why people agree with me, because they see it. Right? And the other thing I wanted to bring up, too, before we get further into this is, Valliant kind of caught himself in a little bit of a pickle in some of his older audios or older interviews. So, and I could be wrong on which ones, but I'm going to try to remember because it really struck me. And I forgot to mention it in the first presentation I did. But what happened was, in I believe it was the first interview he did with Lambert, it was the maybe 2 hour and 45 minute long one. Somewhere in that video, he says, no, let me backtrack. It was prior to that one. Okay, he had 2 hour long presentations on creating Christ that are on Derek's Myth Vision channel. I believe it was part 1 of the 2-part hour long series, where Valliant actually admits that the Jerusalem temple and the law and everything that went on in that temple in Jerusalem was the epicenter of all things Judaism, all things Jew. It was literally the epicenter. Okay, and he uses the exact word, and so does Luther, and they all agree on it, right? It was the epicenter of everything. And then, in the first part of his Israel-only interview with Derek, that was the 2 hour and 45 minute one, Derek actually brings up a question to him that I was very interested to see his answer, and he says, well, the Israel-only guys would argue that the law and sacrifices in Jerusalem and the temple and everything came to an end in AD 70. So that's when this story ends. And they would argue that there's no more, Judaism. There's no more old covenant Judaism today. And so he asked Valliant what he thought about that. And Valiant's response was a little concerning to me. He kind of chuckled and he said, well, he said that the Jews of today would surely disagree. Right? So which one is it? Okay, was the temple truly the epicenter of all things Judaism? Or was it? Right? I mean, because if you're going to say that it was in one breath, and then you're going to come back and argue that what the Jews are doing today is actual biblical Judaism, like the Torah, right? Those two things clash. Because guess what? If you don't have a temple, you don't have the presence of God with the people. Okay, because that's where it was. All right? And if you don't have a temple and you don't have sacrifices, how are they dealing with their sin? Right? Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin. Right? How is any of it working today? The Jews don't even circumcise today. They have some lame procedure that they do that's just nonsense, right? They're not biblical Jews. They're the farthest thing from biblical Jews. So when you say that, oh, well, the Jews would disagree, that's a kind of a shady answer. Because, again, if you acknowledge that everything came to an end when it did, then you can easily see how it matches up to, Christ saying that or Peter saying that the end of all things is at hand, that Paul saying that the present form of this world is passing away, that Jesus saying that all these things will come to an end in this generation, that him saying that I will come for you saints in this generation, or that I will come before some of you standing here die. You see, if you admit that everything ended at the destruction of the temple, then you're bound to honor those time statements because they all wrap up perfectly right there. So that I just found very, very interesting, that in one breath he's admitting that the temple was pretty much everything that Judaism was, right? It embodied everything. It was the epicenter. It was where everything took place. It was the place of God's presence. It was the place of the sacrifices. It was where the high priest would go in to cover the sins of the people, right? And that's gone. That's never been. That's totally gone, never coming back. And the reason why it's never coming back is because it was put away. That whole system came to an end. All right? So just keep that in mind. But let's continue.
And it was a sincere morality designed to be a sincere religion.
So again, he's talking about why the Romans created this story to be a sincere religion, right? But again, the story isn't about a religion. The story is about an elect remnant of overcomers who overcame that great tribulation period and are shown in heaven at the end, standing by the throne, singing salvation belongs to our God. And guess who they are? They're the 12 tribes of Israel. See, that's what we can look at in Revelation. We have the benefit of looking at the final picture and getting sort of a picture of the fulfillment and the end. And that final picture in the end is the 12 tribes in heaven. Only the 144,000 could learn the redemption song. They're standing by the throne saying salvation belongs to our God. Only their names are written on the city. Only they got the Holy Spirit during those last days as well. So we can catch the final picture, which means that everything prior to that has to fit in that final picture. So no, it wasn't to establish a new religion. It wasn't to establish peace. It wasn't anything like that. The peace that Jesus was instructing them to operate in, okay, was simply his way of exhorting them to live peaceably as much as they could until his coming. Okay, they were looking forward to his coming. They were waiting to be saved. They were looking for that day. He said, he who endures to the end shall be saved. And the expectation that was set was that they would be changed in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump, because flesh and blood, the bodies that they were in, could not inherit the kingdom of heaven. So they had to be changed, and they would be caught up into the clouds the same way the firstborn of the brethren, Christ, their Savior, was in Acts chapter 1. Okay, so they would be changed. And Paul even tells them, some of us will not die, but we will be changed. That's your key right there. Jesus' flesh did not see corruption. He died, he rose, he walked out of the tomb, he ascended to heaven. Peter says his flesh did not see corruption. Why? Because his body was not found in the tomb. He rose and ascended into the clouds, and the rest of the brethren were promised the same reality at his coming. They would be changed in the snap of a finger, in the twinkling of an eye, and they'd put on immortality. And they'd be caught up in the clouds with the dead ones, with those who had already fallen asleep, because that was the resurrection. And they would be caught up together with the Lord in the clouds, where they would forever be with him.
One of the important differences is he seems to think that creating Christ is saying that Rome all by itself was creating an empire-wide religion to displace previous religions and to unify all Gentiles and Jews together at the same time. That was never the intention of the New Testament when it was originally written. It was targeted.
Yeah, the funny thing is that if I don't admit that, I don't believe that, and I'd be stupid to, right? Because these weren't letters that were going far and wide. These were letters that were written to specific people. These were letters that were written from people to specific people using specific people's names, okay? And they were sent to specific geographical locations that did exist during those days. And they were talking about specific things that were taking place in those days, right? This wasn't at all intended to be a worldwide unification of Jew and Gentile. I've never claimed that, right? But it makes his position even more asinine, because he's saying that somehow that was the intention, but yet these letters are still only going to a remnant, right? They're only going to the called out ones in each location, right? Ephesus, Galatia. They're only going to the called out ones. They're not going to everybody.
To a very specific, limited audience. It was targeted to the rebellious Jews who were then in great numbers violently rebelling against the Roman Empire because they...
But you see how he's saying that the letters were going to rebellious Jews. But then on the other hand, he's arguing that these were really Gentiles. Well, weren't the letters going to Jew and Gentile? Of course they were, right? So what is it? Are the letters going to rebellious Jews all over the world? Or are they going to Jew and Gentile? I'm not understanding what his argument is.
They believed they could not be both good Jews and good Roman citizens at the same time, forcing them into rebellion against Rome. This phenomenon of Jewish rebellion, messianic, militant, Torah Orthodox rebellion that Christianity is obviously a reaction to.
But it wasn't Torah Orthodox rebellion, okay? Because Paul, in all of his letters, is actually writing to Israelites who had walked away from the law. So these aren't militant Jews who have a hard-on for the Torah. Okay, these are, there's Jews involved, of course, because like he said in Galatians 3, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, if you're Christ, it's because you're an Israelite and an heir according to promise. But this is not just letters written to militant Jews with a hard-on for the Torah. Okay, these are letters written to both Jews and Gentiles, but not outside of the body of the 12 tribes. Remember, when you flash to the end and you see who's standing in heaven at the end, having received the promise, and you hear who Paul told King Agrippa the promise was for, that being the 12 tribes, and you hear who Jesus said he came for only, that being the tribes of Israel, then you can understand that this group of individuals whom is receiving these letters, Jew and Gentile, falls under the larger umbrella category of Israel. Okay, these are the elect from both parties. So it wasn't just Jews who had a hard-on for the law. It was actually paganized Israelites who had a limp biscuit for the law, to put it bluntly, right? They had no passion for the law, right? And that's kind of why they're up shit's creek without a paddle in the first place, because like Paul said in Colossians, they were dead in the trespass of being uncircumcised in the flesh of the foreskin. They should have been circumcised. Like he tells the Ephesians, he says, you were once Gentile in the flesh, meaning you were like the Gentiles in your wiener schnitzel. You weren't snippety snipped, okay? But you have been forgiven. You have been brought back. And like Paul tells the Romans, he says that these ones out in the nations sometimes do what is written in the law of Moses, or what is required in the law of Moses, thereby showing that that law is on their hearts. Why? Because they're tied to the body of Israelites. They have somehow migrated, moved out, went to the nations, fulfilling what Moses predicted at the start, where he said in the latter days there'd be Israelites scattered all abroad, and God would turn and have mercy upon them and remember the covenant he made with their fathers. He said they'd be worshiping wood, stone, the work of men's hands, pagan, not circumcised, but God was going to have mercy upon them and remember the covenant that he made with Abraham. That's exactly what we see Paul say in Galatians 3. If you are Christ's, it is because you are Abraham's seed and an heir according to the covenant promise. That's what Moses said would take place. God would turn and have mercy on the Israelites in the nations and remember the covenant promise that he made to Abraham, their father. This is exactly what's taking place in Galatians 3, and it's exactly what's taking place in all the other epistles. So these Israelites that Paul says in Romans 2 had sometimes done some of the requirements of the law of Moses and thereby showed that that law was written on their hearts. Not literally, but written on the hearts in this story all the way since the beginning in the Old Testament simply meant that it was very important to them. In Deuteronomy 6, we see that the Israelites are told to take this shit seriously, man. Write it on the frontlets of your eyes. Write it on your doorposts. Talk about it when you walk. Talk about it when you lie down. Talk about it when you rise up. The law should be on your heart and in your mind at all times. That's what the law written in the heart meant. It meant it should be completely central and the most important focus of their entire lives. So these ones in the nations being, having come from that, having the generational backstory of the law, wherever they came from, right? And again, this is what I mean about the story. People always want you to have answers, right? Well, how did these ones get there? And how did these ones, not have the law? And what does this mean? Well, guess what? It's not that black and white, okay? You're not getting every fine detail in this story. You're getting a sort of a picture. You're getting plenty of detail. Trust me, it's all there. But you're getting sort of a very general picture of the story. And the picture that Romans 2 paints is that there's Israelites in the nations, paganized, gentilized, if you will, and they sometimes do what the law of Moses requires, and they show that it's written on their hearts, which was a covenant thing that was only for Israel. God didn't declare his laws to anyone other than them. So these descendants of Israel who were living out in the nations were guilty because they did certain things that the law required, and it showed that they had it written on their hearts, and they knew better, right? And their conscience would accuse them in the day of wrath, right? Or in the day of judgment. So it all fits in perfectly, right? And that's why this claim that the Romans somehow wrote this story is asinine. Or not wrote, I shouldn't say wrote because he doesn't say right, but that they somehow created this story and pushed it through and, developed it to sort of start some new religion and new peaceful way of thinking for these militant type Jews. It's just nonsense because these weren't Jews. These were Israelites living in the nations as pagans. They weren't Jews, okay? And they were being gathered in by Paul. So it's a very direct, specific, targeted mission. And it's not only for militant Jews at all, actually, okay? It's for all Israel, both Jew and Gentile.
We agree with him on several things. One, the audience of the New Testament is Israel only. It's aimed at Jews. Or... Okay,
now, you notice how he makes that mistake there. Very intelligent guy. I don't mean to insult him here, but he makes a mistake that everybody makes. Hold on, let me see if I can back this up. Oh, nope, it doesn't allow me to do that like it does on the phone. Usually you can kind of tap it back and it goes back 10 seconds. But let me see something here. 7:54. Let's go back about 10 seconds. Ready? Now pay attention to what he says and listen to how he equates Israel with the Jews, right? And that's a huge blunder because there was Israelites that were not Jews, okay? A Jew is just sort of a way of life, right? Just like being a Roman was a way of life. It was a religious sort of mindset. It was a religious affiliation. But the promise wasn't to the Jews, right? The promise was to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it just so happened that there were Israelites in the Jewish party, those of the circumcision, and there were also Israelites in the non-circumcision, the uncircumcision party. But listen to how he equates the word Israel with Jew here.
Orthodox rebellion that Christianity is obviously a reaction to. So we agree with him on several things. One, the audience of the New Testament is Israel only. It's aimed at Jews.
You see that? The audience of the New Testament is Israel only. It's aimed at Jews. But that's not an accurate statement because the New Testament is not just aimed at Jews. It's aimed at Jews and Gentiles. And when the fullness of the Gentiles came in, what would take place? All Israel would be saved. So you see how Israel kind of sits at the top. It's the top. Picture a Christmas tree. It's the top ornament on the tree. And as you flow down, you have the different parties that come together to make all Israel. And the parties are Jew and Gentile, circumcision and uncircumcision, sheep of this fold, sheep not of this fold, Israel near, Israel far off. Okay, you see how that works. Okay, law practicing Israelite, non-law practicing Israelite, Jew and Gentile. But the most important thing here and the mission is for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It's for all Israel to be saved. And remember, we're flashing to the end where that picture is of the 12 tribes. So the terms Jew and Israel are not the same. Okay, all Jews were not true Israel.
Or people who might be converted to, subject to being or tempted to being converted to Judaism. So unless you're one of these proselytes that he admits were out there, or a Jew, the New Testament was really not addressed to you. Right. We agree.
That's not true either. He says we agree, but that's not what I believe. He just said that unless you're a Jew or a proselyte, the New Testament was not addressed to you. That's not true. Okay, I don't believe that. That's not my position at all, which again, this is kind of why we're talking past each other here. What I believe and what I've said all along is that the Gentiles that were out in the nations, the ones that were appointed to eternal life that Paul talks about in Acts 13, they were Israelites. Okay, they weren't Jews. They were not Jews. They weren't practicing law. They weren't, circumcised. They weren't any of that. They were Gentiles by every sense of the word, except they had that covenantal tie and the promise tie back to Abraham, their father. So they were out in the nations, okay? They weren't proselytes. They weren't Jews. They were Gentiles, okay? And they were living out there dead in the trespass of being uncircumcised in the flesh. If they were proselytes, if they were Jews, they'd be circumcised, okay? But these ones weren't. So that's not true.
We also agree with him in his basic conception of Israel only. Unlike many, when we did the video earlier against Israel only, it was not against Jason Acosta's views.
Can you explain what is Jason's view based off what you heard?
Right.
And I'd love to have him on the show so you could explain it, because this sounds different than what even I've been saying that Israel only is saying, because I've been dealing with the Israel only guys, and I hear that they
Israel only positions, aren't
obviously, because they're saying only genetic descendants of Abraham biologically,
right?
From I'm going to say it, from Abraham's nutsack all the way down. Okay,
That's good. That's good. Now, Derek's right. There are a lot of IO guys who have went that direction, and I am not one of them. Okay, and I told somebody before. I said, I will cut you a check right now for $1,000 and mail it to your house if you can find one time in all of my videos that I specifically come and say that the promise is only for bloodline descendants of Abraham. That is something that I'll stick to right now if you can find. I'll mail you a check because I've never said that, okay? And I never will, because here's the deal, all right? The reality of it is that in places in the Bible, such as Ezekiel, let me go there real quick. Ezekiel, I want to say it's 47. Let's see how good my memory is. Yep, 47. Okay, when the people of Israel are coming back in this return to Zion period that Ezekiel's speaking of here, when the temple's going to be rebuilt, the land's going to be measured again, they're going to divide up the land, like all these promises are being made, the borders and everything. Excuse me. We're reading in Ezekiel 47, and it says, he's going on in verse 18, he says, on the east side you'll mark out the border between Haran and Damascus, and between Gilead and the land of Israel, along the Jordan and along the eastern side of the sea. The south side towards the south shall be from Tamar to the waters of Meribah by Kedesh, along the brook to the great sea. This is the south side. The west side shall be the great sea from the southern boundary until one comes to a point opposite Hamath. This is the west side. So he's going through all these land divisions, right? Now, obviously, that has nothing to do with what took place in AD 70, right? But Don Preston would say it does. But that was actually relevant to what happened in the Return to Zion Second Temple period, right? This is what this is all about. And that starts all the way back in Ezekiel 36 and 37. This is all about Israel, the dry bones, symbolically meaning dead out in the land, getting life again. Breath enters them. They come together. They're resurrected and they enter back into the land. That's exactly what it means. And you just have to go listen to some of my older audios and I prove that up, down, left, right. But look what it says in verse 21. It says, thus you shall divide this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. Verse 22, it says, it shall be that you will divide it by lot as an inheritance for yourselves and for the strangers who dwell among you and who bear children among you. They shall be to you as native born among the children of Israel. Ready? They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. Interesting. So Ezekiel, and there's other passages that state this. This is just the one that always comes to mind. But Ezekiel the prophet speaks of these strangers who link themselves to Israel and bear children among Israel. They would have an inheritance with the tribes of Israel. Now that's interesting because, when you come to the New Testament and you see what Paul says about who Christ died for, well, who did he die for? He says he died for those under the law. So let me ask you, when a person joined themselves to Israel, were they under the law? Of course they were, right? They were under the law, which to me would make them eligible for salvation, right? What else does Hebrews say? Hebrews 9:15 says he died for sins committed under the first covenant or the old covenant. That means that those who were under that covenant Christ would have died for them too, right? It's a pretty bold general statement. He died for sins committed under that covenant. Okay, so then who was under that covenant? Was it just the bloodline? No. It was proselytes too. It was those who joined. It was God-fearers. Right? So I have never taken the strict position. I've always remained somewhat neutral on this. And I don't like to go too far over to one side because I think a case can be made for both. But I think the case is too strong for my side, which is why I keep kind of coming back to it. When you see, who is it, Paul or whoever it is, say, to the seed of Abraham and all you who fear God, this message of salvation was sent, right? How do you deal with that if it's bloodline, right? Or to the descendants or to the stock of Abraham, I think he says. So in other words, here's how I look at it, okay? You have Israelite Jews, and you have Israelite Gentiles, okay, by blood, all right? No one's denying that it's by blood too, okay? I believe it was by blood, but I also believe that those who joined themselves to the covenant body of Israel became eligible, okay? At least that's where I'm kind of, leaning towards now. They became eligible for the promises as well, Okay, if they were going to have an inheritance among the tribes as well, and they were like native born among the children of Israel, as Ezekiel said here, which I just read to you, then why would that change? Right? Why would that change? And we see that in the New Testament when these proselytes, in Acts chapter 1 or 2, wherever it is, devout men, proselytes, Jews from all nations, come and they get the gospel from Peter. All right, so either you have to make the argument that every single person that was there in Acts 2, all those Jews and devout men from all nations, were literal bloodline descendants of Abraham, which seems to me kind of tough to prove, right? It seems a little bit unrealistic. But then again, the whole story is unrealistic, so who knows? But it seems more realistic that if you were a Jew, if you were under the law, if you were under the old covenant, that was what you needed to have in order to reap the benefits of the salvation, right? You didn't have to have the blood of Abraham, but you had to be under that old covenant, okay? So yes, I do believe that these proselytes would have referred to Abraham as their father. Nobody would deny that. Valliant wouldn't argue that. Of course they did. They looked at David as their father, the patriarch David. In Acts chapter 2, when Peter's speaking to these devout men from all nations, he literally says, our father David, or the patriarch David. Right? That's how these proselytes, these God-fearers who joined themselves to the covenant body of Israel, that's how they would have looked at David and Abraham, their father. So to me, the opposite is true, that they would have also been referred to as Abraham's seed. Right? Because remember now, when the promise was made to Abraham at the beginning, it was in his flesh. God was making a covenant promise in his flesh, and that meant in the circumcision. That was in the Wiener Schnitzel. Okay, that's where the promise was. So these proselytes who joined the covenant and were schnippity-schnapped down there, to me, seems like they too would have became Israel. They would have became as native born. They would have had an inheritance among the tribes of Israel, which is what Ezekiel the prophet said. So the promise was in the snippety snap of the Wiener Schnitzel 5 skin, okay? And to me, that just kind of works nicely there. So Israel, to me, is a covenant term more than it is blood. Of course, it includes those of blood, but it also, in my opinion, includes those who join themselves to Israel. Okay, now somebody out there may hear that and say, look, he believes that true pagans could receive salvation. No, I don't. You're misunderstanding and you're assuming things. Okay, what I'm stating is that pagans could join the old covenant body of Israel. Key word is old covenant. No longer in existence, folks. There is no longer any old covenant body of Israel. Okay, the pagans could join it. But at the end, all Israel was saved. So there's no more salvation for any type of Israel, no spiritual Israel. There's nothing like that. That was never even a thing. Spiritual Israel is just an invention that isn't biblical. So, yes, they could join Old Covenant Israel, and that would have made them eligible for salvation because they were under the curse of the law, which was only given to Israel. I hope that makes sense. But, again, there were there were Israelites in the Jewish party, and there were Israelites in the Gentile party. And they were of the blood. But also I believe that the God-fearers, the faithful God-fearers that were part of the covenant, were also granted the ability to receive the redemption and salvation. At least that's how I see it right now. Regardless, though, okay, I always like to give you that border patrol that cuts it all off at the ankles, okay? Here's the deal. As I said before, when we look to the end of the story, what do we see? We see the 12 tribes of Israel standing in heaven and nobody else. Only the 12 tribes could learn the redemption song. Only the 12 tribes. So guess what? If only the 12 tribes could sing and learn the redemption song, and if only they are shown in heaven, if only their names are written on heaven, and if only them are getting the sealing of the Holy Spirit, then the proselytes, or those God-fearers that we see getting salvation in the New Testament, they have to be part of the 12 tribes. Which to me solidifies my case with what I showed you in Ezekiel, where the stranger who joined to Israel would become as native born and would have an inheritance with the tribes of Israel. So that's how I see it. But let's continue here.
Precisely right. If you're not a literal genetic descendant of Abraham, you're out. Or maybe even Israel, you're out. This is Israel only. And if you're
he's talking about some people who hold to the literal genetic blood view, okay, which is not my view. It's the view of some guys who are great friends of mine hold this view. And that's fine. I'm not going to go to war over it with them. As I said before, you can make a case for both. But for me, there's just too much that shows that it was open to the God-fearers. And it also is, it's a little too hard for me to come to the conclusion that literally every single person that we see in the New Testament, like all the Jews that came back and the 3,000 that were saved, and or however many souls were added to the kingdom, they were all literal bloodline. That just seems a little tough for me. What seems a lot easier for me to reconcile is that it was a covenant salvation, right? If you were under the old covenant, whether you were law observant or supposed to be law observant, you were eligible for salvation.
You're not part of that family, literally part of that family, you're not involved. Now, that view is hard to defend, and Jason
I agree.
DaCosta wisely does not defend such a view. What he believes is an adoptionist, covenant-type view. One can become a member of Israel. He starts out by saying, look, the identification of who the lost tribes or the lost sheep are doesn't really matter. We don't need to pin that down, nor did Paul. These people could, in fact, be totally pagan Gentiles with no Abrahamic or Israel descent.
No, this is wrong. Let him continue, but he's misrepresenting me here.
At all.
Right.
Indeed, Jason goes so far as to say that at least in Paul, we've opened it up to people who've never ever practiced Torah in an orthodox way. People who've never participated in the original covenant with Abraham.
Okay, so he's way off on this. And I'm going to read you one of the comments that Shanny Truthseeker left. And Shanny knows me very well and talks to me quite often. And he really nailed it when he said this. He said, this is for James. At around the 10-minute mark, which is now, he says, you are saying that Jason's view is that a non-Israelite can come into the faith. But that is not Jason's view. Jason believes that those Gentiles that come in are true blood descendants. That's correct. So to be clear, James thinks Gentiles means people other than Israelites. But what he fails to see is that Gentiles include the lost sheep descendants of Israel. So when the apostles went out into the nations, true blood descendants of Israel would hear the message of Christ, and it was them that came in. So Shanny nails it, okay? Like I just stated, these ones who are out in the nations living as pagan would sometimes do the things that the law of Moses required, thereby showing that the work or that the law was written on their hearts. Why were they sometimes doing the things that the law required? Well, in my opinion, and of course this really can't be backed up by any specific text, but we do have historical data that suggests that the Israelites did walk away from the covenants just 200 years around the time of the book of the Maccabees details this. They leave the covenants and they go out and they assimilate with the Gentiles. They give up circumcision. They say the hell with the Sabbath days. They basically just walk away from it all, right? And some of them even had procedures to remove the circumcision, right? So you have a couple centuries before this would have been written, in Romans 2 anyway, at least in the traditional view, not in the creating Christ view anyway. But you have a couple centuries before, you have a detailed account of Israelites actually doing this, going out to the nations, saying the hell with the law, the hell with Torah. And to me, it just kind of makes perfect sense. You have, whatever that is, 4, 5, 6 generations before the beginning of it, or who knows, it could have even went on earlier than that, which it probably did, because there were Israelites everywhere, and Valliant knows this. By the time of Christ, it's estimated that a third of the populations of the surrounding countries around Israel were Israelites. They were Jews. They were dispersed Jews who had left and went into these countries and dispersed all over. Right? And of course, we know that quote from Josephus, which is always a dagger. It says that, hold on, I have it right here. Let me pull it up. I did a audio on this before, and it was just super powerful. But yeah, Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote in Antiquities of the Jews, book number 11, chapter 5, he wrote, "The 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers." So even Josephus knew in his writings that the 10 tribes, right, the lost tribes of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, were out beyond the Euphrates in the nations, right? So what does that tell you? Okay, it tells you that my hypothesis and my thinking on this is not far off, and it's actually true. Because these Israelites had, in whatever form or fashion, they'd migrated out to these nations, and many of them had left the laws. And that's why Moses predicted it in Deuteronomy 4. He said, in the latter days, many Israelites would be out in the nations, scattered, worshiping the work of men's hands, wood and stone. But God would go and have mercy on them and remember the covenant that he made with their fathers. And that's exactly what's taking place. So this Romans 2 portion, where it shows these ones doing the things that the law of Moses required, these were Israelites. These were blood descendants. These were descendants of Abraham. Okay, these weren't proselytes that joined themselves to the Jews. These were Israelites. Okay, these were ones that had at one time, their ancestors had at one time been part of the law, been part of the covenants, and probably just by sheer tradition and just being around it, they would have picked up on some of the things. Like picture your great grandfather, right? Picture he was a Jew and he was heavily involved in the Torah. And then one day he decided he was going to up and leave and go out to the nations and give all that crap up, right? Because of his former ties to the Torah and how seriously he took it at one point, you can imagine that how much that absorbed of his life and how important that probably was to him at one time. You can almost imagine that some of those things would have stuck with him as he ventured out into those nations, right? And he sort of gave it up. But he wasn't able to give it all up because certain things stuck, certain traditions. He did certain things that the law required, right? And so that was kind of passed on to Israelite, to their descendant and their descendant, right? And then here you are in the first century, and Paul's writing to them saying, hey, you sometimes do things that the law requires. Guess what? It's because the law is written on your heart. And that was only relative to Israel, like I've shown before. Isaiah, I think it's 51:7, you people in whose heart is my law. He's speaking to Israel. Deuteronomy 6:6, write this on your heart and mind. Jeremiah 31:31, I will write my laws on their hearts and minds. He's speaking of the house of Israel and the house of Judah when he took them back from Babylonian captivity. So this was only about Israel. And lest we forget, the only ones that this story ever shows that had the law given to them was Israel. Nobody else. In fact, the prophets go above and beyond to declare that God did not declare his laws to anyone other than Israel. So if Paul's telling these ones in Romans 2 that the law is written on their hearts, and they're proving that it's written on their hearts by doing some of the things it requires, then who do you think they are? Right? They have to fall under the Israel context because God only gave his laws to Israel. These are not pagans who are somehow just by chance doing some of the things that the law of Moses requires. Right? They're doing it by sheer habit and sheer tradition.
Circumcision. People who've never practiced kosher diet. Okay.
Correct, because they probably were generational, right? Their ancestors had gone out to the nations, and they were out there for, who knows how many years. Again, the details are not what's important here, okay? Sometimes people like to argue and get caught up in the details, like, oh, that seems impossible, right? Like how, in other words, here's one. How could God keep track of Israelites out in the nations? Don't you think they would mix and, assemble or mix in with other, nationalities and, come and sort of become hybrid blends of people? Like, how could that even be? See, that's not what the story is concerned about. In this story, you see from the beginning, even in the Old Testament, I believe it's in Malachi. I believe I can find this pretty quickly. Let me put you on pause for 1 sec. Okay, so it's actually Micah. Micah chapter 3, you can see a little bit of this here. Hold on, let's see. Is it 3? No, it's 2. It says, Israel restored, Micah 2, verse 12. It says, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like the sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make a loud noise because of so many people. They will pass through the gate, go out by it. Their king will pass before them with the Lord at their head. So here's an example of the Israelites out in the nations, okay? And here's Micah predicting, through God, I guess, that he God is going to restore them and bring them back. He's going to assemble them. Israel, Jacob, he's going to bring them back from all the places that they were, right? Well, the logical argument would be, well, how did they, they were out there for so long. How is God, going out there and finding them where they are? Like, how did he preserve them? Wouldn't they have mixed in with multitudes of people? But you see how the story isn't really concerned with the logistics of it as much as it's concerned with stating what it states, right? These are truths that aren't to be looked into with such fine detail, right? And if you look at, let's see, I think it's Micah 5. There's another example here. It says this, Micah 5 verse, 6. Says, when the Assyrian comes into our land and when he treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. They shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders. Now listen to this, verse 7. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, that tarry for no man, nor wait for the sons of men. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, who, if he passes through, both treads down and tears in pieces, and none can deliver. Your hand shall be lifted against your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. And in that day, says the Lord, I will cut off your horses from your midst and destroy your chariots. I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down all your strongholds. I will cut off sorceries from your land. Your carved images I will cut off, and your sacred pillars from your midst. You shall no more worship the work of your hands. I will pluck your wooden images from your midst. Thus I will destroy your cities, and I will execute vengeance and anger and fury on the nations that have not heard. So here we are. We see that God is predicting that the Israelites are going to be in the midst of many peoples, in the midst of nations, right? Like sheep among lions, right? And then God would obviously come and destroy the chariots and the horses and seek vengeance on the nations. But again, God always had an eye on his people, right? The apple of his eye. He knew where they were, okay? He protected those who needed to be protected according to the story, of course. Who knows what's really true and what's not. But again, if you're going to argue, this doesn't seem logical, like they would have surely inbred, or not inbred, but, breeded with other, nationalities and whatnot, then, you're getting a little too technical for the story. The story isn't about that. The story is about, generalized statements that show that God was in control of his people. And even when they were in the midst of other nations and other peoples, and when they were in danger, he always preserved them and he protected them. And that's exactly what follows through all the way to the end of the story, right? So you see, that these Israelites are being called out from every nation, tribe, tongue, and kindred, like Revelation 5 says.
So you can be full Gentile, fully pagan, not connected to the family of Abraham, never have practiced, strictly speaking, the Torah, never have practiced circumcision, the original covenant itself, or kosher diet, and still be included as a member.
You see, that's a straw man, and maybe he's just innocently misunderstanding me, but I never said that you couldn't have any tie to Israel. In fact, you all know that I said that the Gentiles who were being saved were the ones that had the ties, right? They were the ones who, perhaps their ancestors, somehow they were related, they were tied to the covenant body. I mean, this is obvious, right? Paul asks in Romans 9, is God then therefore also merciful to the Gentiles? And then he quotes 3 passages which are all about Israel. Let me pull it up just so I can read it. Look at what Paul does here, right? When he talks about Israel. In verse 22, he says, verse 22, what if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make known his power, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy which he had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles? So you ask this question, but also of the Gentiles, the mercies also coming upon the Gentiles? And then look what he does. He quotes Hosea. He says, as he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved, who is not my beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. That's all about the lost sheep of Israel. If you go to Hosea and read that passage, it's about the scattered Israelites in the nations. And Paul is offering that up as an answer to his question, is God having mercy on the Gentiles? Right? It's very clear what he's doing. And then in verse 27, he lofts this up, right? So now listen to this. So he asks, but also of the Gentiles? And then look what he says in verse 27. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. Right? So again, he's lofting it up. He's saying, is God having mercy on these Gentiles? And then he answers, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though their number be as the sand of the sea, the remnant of them will be saved. So again, he's telling you who these ones are. They're Israelites. And then he goes on in verse 29 again, and he says, and as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, unless the Lord had left us a seed of Israel in the nations, or wherever they were scattered, they would have become like Sodom and Gomorrah. So Paul pretty much just outlines that clearly. And of course, that's why when we get 2 chapters later, when he says, in this way all Israel will be saved, he says, when the fullness of the ones in the nations comes in this way all Israel will be saved. Because, of course, they had to gather in all the Israelites from all places where they were. And the mission of all Israel saved would not be complete until that was fulfilled. So again, James is misrepresenting me. I've never said that these Gentiles were true pagans with no association to Abraham whatsoever. Never at all. In fact, when Paul looks at them in Galatians 3 and says, hey, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, right? Because he's speaking to both. He's not just speaking to militant Jews. He's speaking to Jews and Gentiles. He says, if you're Christ's, doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile. The reason why you're Christ is because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise, right? Abraham's seed, that's Israel. It's always Israel in this story. I can prove that up, down, left, right. You want 10 passages? You want 50? Do you want 100? I can give you them. Because every single time the term Abraham's seed is used, it's Israel. So when Paul says, if you're Christ, it's because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise. What he's actually saying is, if you're Christ, it's because you're an Israelite and an heir according to the promise. Okay, so again, the Gentiles absolutely were connected to Abraham. They were heirs according to promise. The elect Gentiles were heirs according to the promise. And who was the promise made to? You guessed it, Abraham.
A full member, in Mr. Acosta's view, of the house of Israel.
And you agree, of course. You agree.
You could be any. So, in Mr. Acosta's view, it's a fully adoptionist view that Paul and the New Testament take.
No, it's not a fully adoptionist view. They're adopting Israel back into the covenant, right? And if you look at Romans 9, Paul actually says who the adoption's for, right? He says it's for Israel. Right? Now remember the parable of the prodigal son. Okay, how perfect does this work with the Israelites near and the Israelites afar off, with the Israelites who are law practicing and with the Israelites who are not law practicing? Here you have the father, you have his 2 sons, right? One son stays home, the other son leaves, goes out to the nations to roll around with the filth, the uncleanness, to roll around in mud and muck with pigs and filth. Right? And then you see this picture of this son coming back, right? Jesus gives this parable of the son returning to the father. And guess what? The other son who stayed, representing the Jewish fold, he's jealous, right? He's kind of pissed off. He's angry. He's jealous because the father accepted him back. And the thing is the son that represents the Jews, right? The sheep of this fold, as Jesus called them, he's angry and bitter because he's practicing the law all along, and yet the other one was not practicing the law all along, but yet he's still receiving mercy from the Father. Right? And this is what Paul's trying to break down all along, is that enmity between Jew and Gentile, right? He says it, and I think it's Romans 10, I believe it is, or Romans 11, one of the places. He says, that they're being provoked to jealousy. The Jews were being provoked to jealousy by the elect remnant from the nations, because they were coming back in. That is a perfect picture of the prodigal son, the jealous prodigal son who saw the other son come back from the unclean nations. Right? That's exactly what the parable of the prodigal son is. All right, so the adoption was for Israel. It's not for pagans, true pagans. It's for paganized Israelites. They're coming back like the prodigal son. You know that the Old Testament says that only Israel was who God knew. God did not know any other people other than Israel. Out of all the families of the earth, Amos 3 says, only Israel I have known. So then, if the ministry is a ministry of reconciliation, right, which therefore demands that at one point these people were kind of connected to the covenant body or their ancestors or however it works, in order for that to work, they must have somehow had some connection to the covenant body of Israel. And of course we know they did, because Paul tells them, they're Abraham's seed and they're an heir according to promise. If they got the Holy Spirit, it was proof that they were Abraham's seed. In other words, it was proof that they were an Israelite. But that's the whole point here. Okay, so it's just amazing that this misrepresentation is taking place here, because I've never once, my entire argument is that the Gentiles are Israelites. They're not pagans, right? They're just paganized Israelites who had been so far buried in trespasses and sins and violations of their law and their code of law that they were literally dead in the trespass, and they were just dead in trespasses and sins. And of course, Christ, the message went out far and wide for them to hear. And they heard the good news, and they came back to their shepherd. And that's why he came only for the lost sheep. He was seeking the sheep. And again, the only people that ever have that designation in this story is Israel. No one is ever called a sheep but Israel.
To membership in the house of Israel.
Right.
Full stop. Creating Christ agrees. And that accomplishes everything the Romans wanted to accomplish.
Right. Because, they wouldn't have changed that. That wouldn't have been a part of the whole thing.
Rather than changing the whole empire to this new religion, all Rome was seeking to do was pacify an existing group, changing it as little as possible, addressing them on their own language in a way that would persuade them.
Okay.
So if you're
So let me get this straight. So the Romans went about this by inventing a story that says, don't worry about being circumcised. Don't worry about doing the Sabbath. So now it's to pacify these militant Jews. They created this story. It's just, there's so many different ups and downs with this explanation. It just doesn't really make sense.
trying to persuade rebellious, violent Messianic Jews of the first century.
Yeah, but they're not, because again, the entire New Testament is a story of breaking down the wall between elect Jews and elect Gentiles. Okay, he's focusing so much in on this theory of these militant Jews who need to be pacified. But if you look at what the New Testament is doing, it's not just focused on Jews. Okay, it's focused on Gentiles, elect, predestined Gentiles. And Paul is working to break down the wall of hostility between the two, which was the law. Obviously, there was enmity over the law. The Jews looked at those dirty, unclean, prodigal son Israelites out in the nations and thought they were dogs. They thought they were unclean, but really they were their brethren. All right? And Paul is telling them all the time, like, hey guys, listen, knock it off. If you're Christ, you're Abraham's seed, you're brethren. Enough with all the bullshit. Right? So I think he's a little bit confused on that. It's not all about militant Jews here. This is about a mission to gather in all the elect from both parties. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this real quick, and I'm going to jump forward and see where we are, because we're only 11 minutes in, and I'm already almost an hour and a half in, so we have to get moving here. And I've already addressed a lot of the arguments and what I've said thus far, but I'm going to try to bump forward. So give me 1 second, and I'll be right back. All right, so now he's going to talk about Jesus and make a few comments. Let's see.
Right, so you're not saying there wasn't a guy named Jesus that was probably a messianic figure, apocalyptic, and
If there was a historical Jesus, however, I think that Jason DaCosta needs to come to terms with the fact that he was Torah orthodox. Paul appears to be making the first argument that you don't have to adhere to the law, and that Jesus' death and resurrection had altered metaphysically our relationship to the law.
Okay, so that is not exactly true, because when you look at what Jesus says in the Gospels, he's already telling the Jews that he had sheep not of this fold, right? Let's put it this way, if the sheep not of this fold are not speaking of non-law practicing Israelites, then who is he speaking of there, right? Because he's speaking to Jews and he's telling them, I have sheep not of this fold. Caiaphas, when he prophesied in the Gospels, he said that Christ died not only for the nation, but also for all the sons of God scattered abroad. Jesus in Matthew 24:14 told them that the gospel would go to all nations, and then the end would come. So it wasn't just a Torah-focused mission. Jesus said he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He commissioned them to go where? Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, or the ends of the land, to gather in the elect from the four winds of the earth. And it wasn't just Jews who were elect. The Gentiles were elect too. This is what you have to realize. Paul in Acts 13 says, as many Gentiles that were appointed to eternal life believed. So this wasn't just elect Jews, this was elect Gentiles as well. All right, let's try to jump forward a little bit and see what else he says. All right, I'm going to pick it up over here where he's talking about something else.
What creating Christ is saying. When we say creating Christ, we're not talking about inventing a Jesus that might have existed, nor are we saying that Jews were not involved. Mr. DaCosta seems to ignore a large class of Jews who were working with the Romans and who were pro-Roman. Jason DaCosta asks rhetorically the question, why would the Romans ever or even approve of or support a notion that would have something that praises Israeli history, it praises Hebrew scripture, worships the Jewish God, says it's only for Israel? That just makes no sense to it. But that is a fundamental misconception of what the Romans were up to. The Romans were simply redirecting a certain group of messianic militants into a peaceful direction.
That's such nonsense, folks. You see what he's saying? He's making the entire New Testament, he's forcing it down the bottleneck of violent messianic Jews. And that's not at all what the New Testament is about. Okay, not at all. Okay, these so-called violent messianic Jews were just part of the story, and they weren't even violent, right? I mean, he can throw a couple examples out and, obviously take them out of context. But this was equally about the Israelite Gentiles too, okay? It was about Jew and Gentile. It was about the circumcision and the uncircumcision. It was about the law-practicing Israelite and the non-law-practicing Israelite. These were not all messianic, Torah, boner, hard-on Jews, okay? Not by any sense of the word. All right, it just doesn't work, and he keeps coming back to that, but it just doesn't make any sense because these letters were written to Gentiles who were not practicing the law. They were dead in trespasses. That means they're violating the law because they're not practicing. They're dead in the uncircumcision of the flesh, Paul said. That means that they're not circumcised, and they should have been. What did Paul tell the Colossians? He said Christ has wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, having nailed it to the cross. What is the handwriting of requirements? Was the law of Moses ever against pagans? Was it ever binding on pagans? God didn't declare his law to anyone other than Israel. So these ones in Colossae who were being told by Paul, right, that Christ had nailed the handwriting of laws and ordinances to the cross that was against them, these are Israelites. Same thing in Ephesians. He says that he has abolished the law in his flesh. Okay, he has taken it out of the way and nailed it to the cross. That's because the law was the curse. And that's what was binding over the Israelites. Okay, like James said, if you were guilty of one point, you were guilty of it all. And Paul is very clear that it was the law that was the curse. And as many as were under the law, those were the ones that were under the curse. You see, what Valliant tends to do is he forgets that there's a mission and a curse and things that are being dealt with in this story, and he just rushes into the idea that this is something about messianic, militant, angry, violent Jews only. Okay, but that's so far from the truth. That isn't even true, number one. And number two, the Jewish aspect of this is just a portion of the story. There's a whole other portion of the story, and that is the elect coming in from the nations. And when the fullness of those nations came in, all Israel would be saved.
The New Testament is what we focus on to the exclusion of all else. Nothing can be further from the truth. Everything in the New Testament supports creating Christ. Everything. He seems to ignore, for example, that the Jesus apocalypse, while we agree that the Jesus apocalypse is calling for a first century messianic arrival, a first century judgment of some kind with a first century glorious coming of Jesus, the Jesus apocalypse points to a messianic arrival in the first century. Mr. Acosta and I agree about that. Totally agree about that. What we disagree about is that that might be the only messianic arrival that was being expected. That closes out the religion with this one messianic arrival. That is...
Well, the problem is that there's no religion, all right? This isn't a new religion that these guys think. This is a mission that is being fulfilled and conducted. What do you think the Great Commission is? It was a mission that Jesus gave to his disciples and his apostles to complete. Okay, you don't just give somebody a mission and say, "Oh, you're never going to complete this. Just keep going on," right? This is a new religion. No, that's dumb. That's what Christianity says. What the New Testament actually says is that this was a mission. It was not a new religion, okay? And the mission was to seek the elect from the four winds of the earth, all right? So it's not a new religion. There's no multiple messianic comings. Yes, the door ended, the case was closed, and all Israel was saved, right? I mean, Valliant argues that the Romans created this story, right? And they're creating Christ as some messianic figure, right? And now, they're doing it so people can worship him. Okay, but yet the story says that all those who belong to Christ would be raised at his coming. And the story also puts his only coming right there in that generation and coinciding with the fall of Jerusalem. So if the Romans really wanted this to be a new religion, then why the hell do it that way, right? Why make all those who are Christ's, right? Like, because Jesus said all those who are mine will be raised on the last day, and I won't lose one of them. Paul said all those who are Christ would be raised at his coming, and then came the end. Why have an end when all those who belong to Christ, why have it happen in that first century? Why have it happen so quickly? Why is the gospel message urgently going out? And why does it have to reach the nations far and wide before the end, before the destruction of the temple? Why? If this was a new religion that was supposed to sort of take on a forever sort of feel and serve a purpose or an agenda, then what is the reasoning for making it come to a screeching halt? Okay, and yes, it does come to a screeching halt. This is one of his arguments later on in this presentation, is that the burden's on me to prove and to show that the New Testament actually ends the story. Well, that's the easiest thing I could ever do, and we'll get to that. But in this video, we'll get to that. But that's all I've ever been doing. And I don't have to sit here and do this for another hour, and prove that with you guys. You followed me. All the things I've presented show that everything came to an end and coincided with his coming. That's when all Israel was saved. That's when all those who were Christ were raised. That's when all those who belonged to Christ were delivered to God, and then came the end. That's it. And that's the picture of the 12 tribes standing in heaven. It all had to end at the coming of the Lord, which was the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish age. That was when everything wrapped up. Israel's history, as they knew it, came to a close. That's what this story is about. This story is not picking up a new religion and running with it. This is a mission. This is a detailed account of a mission.
In Hebrew literature, they had many messiahs. Joshua, David, the Maccabees. There could be many glorious comings of a Messiah, because guess what? They're all mortal men. They're not gods. This is a monotheistic religion. We can have multiple comings of a Messiah.
Yes, he's right. There were many messiahs. In fact, I believe that Zerubbabel was one of the messiahs as well. They're not messiahs, but messianic type figures, saviors, if you will. And what's different about the New Testament, though, is that it's the last days. Okay, show me anywhere in the Old Testament where you have any kind of language about last days. Okay, and that's another thing. Here's Valliant, arguing that Rome is trying to create this new religion. It's starting off a new religion, yet the entirety of the New Testament is all about the last days, right? And so, and the gathering in of the elect before the end of those last days, right? So it all culminates and comes to a screeching end right at the end. But the difference in the New Testament is that nowhere in the Old Testament with any of those messiahs or any of those savior figures, right, do you have any kind of even remotely close language and discussion of what you have in the New Testament, right? The New Testament last days are going to lead them into the promise that the 12 tribes had hoped to attain for all those centuries backdated all the way back to the fathers, right? That's what Paul told King Agrippa. He said, I stand here and am judged for the hope of the promise made to our fathers, to which the 12 tribes earnestly serve God day and night, hoping to attain. So that's the difference, is that the culmination of everything that the Israelites had hoped to attain, the promise of the age to come, was right there on the cusp. They were in the last days. They were about to inherit that. And also, nowhere in the Old Testament do you have any mentioning whatsoever of any kind of immortality, any kind of angelic body, any kind of glorified immortal body, any kind of there will be no more death, you'll be like angels in heaven. You don't have any of that discussion anywhere in the Old Testament. Nowhere. And the reason is because, again, this was the end. This was the coming of their Messiah, the one that they had, supposedly waited for. And he was going to bring them into this age to come, okay, where there would be no more death, no more pain, no more tears. And it was the same age to come that flesh and blood could not inherit. So they had to be changed in the twinkling of an eye. So yes, the Messiah at the end was the one final Messiah, according to the story, of course. And he was the one that was going to take them into that hope that they had served God earnestly day and night for all those years, hoping to attain. That is the difference. Moving right along, let's get into another point.
We've mentioned this, but
Jason never recognizes the potentially pro-Roman aspect of the Jesus apocalypse. He agrees that a first-century Messiah is being predicted by Jesus. Jesus is saying there's going to be a glorious messianic coming in your guys' lifetimes. Okay? Well, that dovetails perfectly with the Flavian claims, these Roman emperors' claims to being Jewish messiahs, to being the very thing, the Jewish Messiah. So in other words, the Synoptic Gospels would prove the claims of the Flavians. They would demonstrate if what the Flavians are saying is true and what Jesus' apocalypse is true. And let me suggest that Jesus' apocalypse was written after the Flavians had come to the throne and after the destruction of the temple, so that they could discuss the destruction of the temple.
So the Jesus apocalypse was written after the destruction of the temple, so that they could discuss the destruction of the temple, right? Sounds a little silly, but let's continue.
But the fact is, he nowhere discusses how a first-century messianic arrival would be perfectly consistent with Roman propagandistic aims.
well, would you agree with?
Nor does he seem to appreciate that the general message of peace, turning the other cheek, paying your taxes, would all be consistent with Roman interests.
Yeah, but that is not a powerful point, right? Like, anybody in any part of the world could talk about peace and could relate it to anybody in any part of the world and say it relates to so-and-so, or that's a principle that this country believes in, or, it's such a generalized statement and point that it really isn't powerful, in my opinion. To say that, Jesus told these saints, right, to abide by the law and to pay their taxes and to turn the cheek and to try to live peaceably, and then somehow try to connect that to, Rome had to be behind this. It's just a very weak point, in my opinion. And the passages, like I said in the first part that I did, that they used to sort of back this up, like the Roman centurion and the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, like, they're just very weak, in my opinion, right? And they certainly don't trump the Everest-sized mountain of passages that I brought forth that show that this is actually exalting Israel and is not a new religion. It's a mission, right? And that's, again, the thing that's going to come back and haunt him in all of these, videos for all time until he realizes it, is that, again, this is not a new religion, okay? This is a mission that's being detailed. It has nothing to do with a new religion. If it was a new religion, then all Israel wouldn't have been saved by the coming. If it was a new religion, then all those who are Christ wouldn't have been saved by the coming. If it was a new religion, then all those who belong to Christ wouldn't have been raised on the last day, and then came the end. If it was a new religion, you would have seen more people than just the 12 tribes of Israel singing the redemption song in heaven at the end. So it wasn't a new religion, okay? It was a no inclusion, Israel-only mission for the elect. Okay, and let's see what else he says.
Indeed, how softening the Torah orthodoxy would be consistent with Roman interests, or opening up membership into the house of Israel in an adoption.
Again, why would softening the Torah message be of interest to the Romans? They had literally just done away with the Torah forever, really, if you think about it. By getting rid of the temple the way that they did and everything that was associated with it, there was literally no more Torah. Okay, now, of course, he makes the argument that I believe that Jews were no longer around after AD 70. No, that's not at all what my argument is. I know that the strong majority of them were killed and taken captive and everything, but sure, there were still, little subsets and groups of Jews scattered throughout. Of course, they didn't do away with all of them. But the source, the power of the Jews, right? The complete power was shattered when that temple fell. And he even admitted it. It was the epicenter of all things Judaism. So it makes no sense to suggest that the Romans, long after they had destroyed Judaism and buried it into the dirt, would invent this story and try to soften Judaism, if you will, after they just dropped a nuclear bomb on the temple and everything associated with Judaism just prior, right? They instead of taking force, right? Instead of doing things the way that the Roman Empire always did things, by effing people up, for lack of a better term, they now decided that they were going to create this tale and soften the Torah, right? It's totally inconsistent.
In a sense, to people who are total Gentiles who've never been circumcised, again, helps the Roman interests.
He keeps saying these ones had never been circumcised. Yeah, that's exactly right. They were dead in the trespass of being uncircumcised, like Paul said. They were supposed to be circumcised, and they weren't. Okay, and we know that, obviously, just take a look at the Maccabees. It's right in there. The Israelites were leaving the law. They were abandoning the practice of circumcision. Okay, it's all right there. All right, but if you choose to ignore it, then, hey, that's on you. Let's take a look and see what else he has to say.
That he is himself accepting a notion of Israel only that Jews have never accepted.
Go into detail on what you're talking about when you said that, because you mentioned something about that. But can you?
And this is the key. Paul.
Now pay attention here, folks, because he's totally misrepresenting me here, and I doubt it's intentional, because he seems like a good guy, like I said. So I don't take this as being intentional. But again, he's going back on the argument that I believe that true pagan non-Israelites with no relation to Abraham whatsoever could enter into the promises. Right, and what he's going to say is that no Jew ever believed that, right? But yet he's misrepresenting me, because that's the complete opposite of what I've said, right? I'm the one who has been saying that, yes, they were related to Abraham, which is why Paul tells them, doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, if you're Abraham's seed, then you're Christ and an heir. If you're Christ, then you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. So they had to first be Abraham's seed. In other words, they had to first be an Israelite. And then that would make them eligible for the promise. But listen to what he says here and how he misrepresents me completely. And I'm glad that Shani, Truth Seeker, made that comment because it seems like he gets it. And he's been following me, and I'm sure all of you have too. So you get it. But here we go.
All in the New Testament have opened up membership in Israel in a symbolic and adoptive way.
Okay, so now he's saying that I believe that Paul in the New Testament has opened up adoption into Israel. Okay, now ready?
According to Mr. Acosta.
Even according to me.
Mr. Acosta, the literal seed of Abraham or Israel doesn't matter. And indeed, you may never have, or your ancestors may never have practiced the covenant of Abraham, circumcision, or kosher diet. What a curious animal that is that he's...
But again, I've never said it the way he's saying it. See, he's making it seem like, again, I'm saying that these people had no connection back to Abraham. That is not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that these were descendants of Abraham, the pagans living out in the nations, right? That were being gathered back in. Paul says that. In Romans 9, I just went through it with you, okay? Galatians 3, all the passages in Ephesians, Colossians, Romans. You do things that the law of Moses required. Why the hell would a pagan do things that the law of Moses were required when God only declared that law to Israel? Why would Paul say when the fullness of the Gentiles or the nations come in, all Israel would be saved? Paul didn't say when the fullness of the nations came in, all Israel and pagans would be saved. No. He didn't say that when the fullness of the nations came in, then Jacob's deliverer would come and he's also the nation's deliverer. No. When the fullness of the nations came in, all Israel would be saved. And it would be at that time that the deliverer would take away ungodliness from who? From Israel. And he would establish his new covenant with Israel. Okay, so he's really misrepresenting me, but let's let him go on.
Talking about. Mr. DaCosta envisions this fully Gentile person, this proselyte, who is Gentile.
So now we're back on the proselytes.
In every sense that there can be, except that he wants to worship Yahweh as the one true God, and accepts the fact that Jewish literature was the buildup.
No, he's a proselyte. He's circumcised. He's under the covenant. He's an Israelite. He's looks at Abraham as his father. He's considered Abraham's seed. That's what a proselyte was. Okay, it's not this is not a Gentile anymore. Okay, a proselyte became as native born, like I just read to you from Ezekiel. Okay, he became as native born, and he had an inheritance with the tribes. So he's sort of mixing up the two. Right? Let me repeat. You have the Jews, the chosen Jews, and you have the chosen Gentiles. Those are Israelites from both parties. You also have the proselytes who joined themselves to the Jews, who I believe would have been eligible because they too were in the covenant and under the curse of the law. Which is why I don't subscribe to it has to be by blood. Because I believe it's more of a covenant. I believe Israel, the name Israel, is a covenant term, and it was in the flesh, right? The covenant was in the flesh, he told Abraham, the Wiener Schnitzel. And Paul even said the promise was to Israel in the flesh in Romans 9. That doesn't mean in the genetic, biological meat suit. Okay, that means it was in the Wiener Schnitzel, in the circumcision. All right? When you were circumcised, you became Israel. And that's my position.
Creation to this Messiah who made universal salvation possible.
So now it's universal salvation.
The New Testament has opened universal salvation by Mr. Acosta's own definition.
Huh? What? Are you hearing the same thing that I'm hearing? Has this guy listened to any of my teachings? Have I ever said that the New Testament has opened up salvation universally? And what's even more concerning is that he's saying this after he listened to my audio presentation, which was probably filled with at least 30 minutes of me talking about how it wasn't a universal message and it was actually only for the elect. It was only for the chosen ones. It was only for those sheep who would hear his voice and come. And I went to great lengths to explain that even the Gentiles, even the ones in the nations who believed and received the Holy Spirit only received it because they were appointed to receive it. Acts 13. So he's saying that I believe in a universal salvation in the New Testament, and I'm sitting here scratching my head like, what is this guy listening to? What is he saying? And I'm looking at Derek here, and you can tell Derek knows that that's not true. He's kind of like, do I say anything? What do I do here? Like, doesn't want to step on anyone's toes. I get it. But Derek knows that I do not believe that, and everybody else knows that I don't believe that. So let's continue. See what else he has to say and where he goes with that.
And by opening up universal salvation of the Jewish God, by opening up membership in Israel only, he has changed Judaism into a radically different religion. Okay,
so first of all, he's claiming that I believe that the New Testament is a universal salvation story, which is absolutely false. I'm the farthest thing from that. That's why people hate me, actually, because I'm Israel only. Now he's saying that, now he's using that and saying that that clashes with what the Jews believed about the Messiah and everything, which actually, if he just understood that I don't believe that and what I teach is actually the exact opposite, he'd understand that what I teach actually lines up perfectly with what the Jews believe. But let's see what he says.
I think it is impossible for me to imagine that religion was only envisioned to occur for 40 years.
Right.
It wasn't a religion. It was a mission, again.
I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here.
See, Derek knows, so now he's going to say something because he realizes that what Valliant said is not the case. But let's hear it, D. Come on, D. Represent, baby.
And I'll say, I know he takes a kind of a predestinarian,
Boom.
Not Calvinist, but Calvinistic. When I say that, people who are in theology get what I'm saying. That there is an elect, a chosen, a remnant, a chosen select amount that they.
Derek's a smart kid, man. Derek is a smart kid.
Say,
places in the New Testament, especially Paul, where we have a clear doctrine of predestination.
Right.
And even in the Gospels, as Jason points out, Jesus is saying, my sheep will hear me. Those who are of me will hear me. In other words, those who hear me are the elect, in other words. You've been predetermined before birth. God knows, God being God. Of course, the God of the book of Job, for example. Oop, did I kind of lose you?
No, you're good.
The God of the book of Job, for example, is the guy who laid the foundations, right? For the whole of the whole of the world. And so this guy has everything worked out. Our God who created the universe has everything absolutely worked out, right?
Of course. That's what it says.
Now, if that's the case, then predestination is no problem. But what Jason admits is that predestination can include an elect who were never seed of Abraham and had never practiced Torah.
That's not true. And Derek's going to kind of set him straight there in a minute, I think. But that's not true. So he's, again, he's not representing what I believe. And it's not even like he's like close. He's like going complete opposite. It's not even like an attempt to be close. And again, I'm not saying it's intentional. I just think maybe he's not catching where I'm coming from. But this is not at all what I've ever taught. I've always taught that every single person who had salvation, who received that Holy Spirit in the New Testament last days gospel commission, which, by the way, had to be completed by his coming, all fall under the end picture context, which was what? It was the 12 tribes standing in heaven. It was only the 12 tribes singing the new redemption song. It was only the 12 tribes getting the sealing of the Holy Spirit, Revelation 7. And it was only the 12 tribes being written on the new city. So everybody that's saved and sealed with the Holy Spirit in those epistles, in those last days, as the gospel's going out, has to fall into the Revelation 7 context of the 12 tribes of Israel. So I've never strayed from that, ever. That's why people hate me. Okay, I can't stress this enough. I am not a universalist in any sense of the word when it comes to the gospel in the New Testament last days. And everybody out there knows this. So, and his explanation about the elect is kind of silly, right? I mean, he's saying the same. He's admitting that what I'm saying is true, right? He's like, yeah, God's got it all worked out. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. Okay, so this wasn't anything that, was a by the will of those who heard, making a conscious decision. No. Romans 9, before you have done anything good or bad in the womb, God chose Jacob over Esau. Before they had even come out of the womb, having done anything good or bad, God had already chosen Jacob over Esau. So God knew who his sheep were. And the story posits and shows a full number of those sheep, the elect, all saved at the end. Every last one would be raised at his coming, and then come the end. 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus in John 6 said, all those who are mine I will raise on the last day, and I will not lose one. Okay? Peter said God is not slack, but he's waiting until all of them come to repentance. These are full numbers. Revelation 7, do not harm the earth, the trees, the sea, until we have sealed all the servants of our God on their forehead. And I heard the number of the servants. It was 144,000 of the 12 tribes of Israel. So you see how there is a full number. Okay, there is. And that full number had to all be in by the time of the coming. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 24:14 that this gospel would go to all nations and then the end would come. The gospel ended at the same end that he encapsulates in that generation. And that is such an ironclad dagger to the heart of Valliant's doctrine, and he can't realize it. Because let's put it this way. If the Romans created this story, then it means they created Jesus saying that all these things would take place in this generation, right? And if the Romans also created the same story where he says this gospel will go to all nations and then that end will come, the same end that he said would take place in this generation, then that means that the Romans created a story to supposedly create a new religion, right, by way of this gospel, but yet only had the gospel going to the world up until the end, which they put in that generation. Do you see how asinine that argument is? I trust you do. Now let's hear Derek defend me here.
I'd like to hear him say that.
Who's ever believed?
Yeah, I'd like to hear him say that because I don't think he'll say that.
Exactly.
If I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, okay. But by opening it up to people beyond biological Israelites is creating a universal tendency here. Now, you can say that there are elect, of course, a chosen, a remnant, those who are drawn, etc., etc. And you could show how this implication shows that there's selected fews and a remnant and all that idea. However, this breaking down the wall, I think, was the whole point that I was coming at this thing going, dude, Galatians chapter 3, like, Paul's own argument is tearing down what makes one a son of Israel. And so if that's what I've been saying this whole time, and Jason's saying, hey, look, we're good, then we're good. We're on the same page.
Well, one thing to note on that whole breaking down the wall thing, the breaking down the wall, if you really think about it, the Paul tells you what that wall is, right? It's the law. He said the enmity was the law, and that's what Christ came to abolish in his flesh. He says he nailed the handwriting of requirements to the cross, right? So the enmity was the law. That was the wall. That was the middle separation between the two parties. Well, if you think about Israel's history, did they ever have any enmity over the law with outer nations? I mean, think about them in Babylonian captivity, for example. The Babylonians allowed them to practice their law in their own community within Babylon. I don't see a lot of enmity there. Okay, as we go through right up until the time of, the end in AD 70, there was really not a lot of enmity over the law when it came from other, nations. In fact, the Roman Empire pretty much, allowed the Jews to worship their own God in their own way. Right? I mean, we all know that as good, honest, Bible-seeking historian students, whatever you want to call it. We all know this. So was there really enmity over the law between, just let's say, Romans and Jews, right? Were the Romans really pissed about the law? To me, it doesn't seem like they really cared, right? They just kind of said, yeah, do your own thing. The enmity was between the Jew and the Israelite dispersed, scattered in the nations. Now, we don't have to look very far to know that the Jews knew they were out there. Just look at John 7. Jesus is speaking to them, and he says, where I go, you cannot come. And they look at each other, the Jews, and they say to each other, where does he intend to go? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach them? So the Jews obviously knew that there were the dispersed Israelites living out in the nations. Jesus knew the dispersed Israelites were living out in the nations. Okay, he said, I have sheep not of this fold. Okay, he also told them, don't go into any cities of the Samaritans, don't go to the cities of the Gentiles, but rather go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, go to those places to seek out the lost sheep. And this is what Revelation 5 says. It says that the sheep were called out from every nation, tribe, tongue, and kindred. They weren't going out for the nations, tribes, tongues, and kindreds. They were going out to call the sheep out from every nation, tribe, tongue, and kindred. So we really need to think about the enmity, which was the law, and we have to ask ourselves, how much enmity was there really between other nations and Israel over Israel's law? It doesn't seem to me that other nations were very envious or bitter or jealous that Israel had the law. Okay, they all had their own religions and their own gods, and they could give two shits. So again, the real enmity is between the prodigal sons. Okay, it's between the Jew who stayed home with the father and who kept the law, and it's between the Israelite who was out in the nations, scattered, fulfilling the promise that Moses made in the beginning, fulfilling everything that Paul says in Romans 9 about how even though Israel's scattered, the remnant will be saved, fulfilling everything that we see. And ultimately fulfilling the fullness of them coming in, resulting in all Israel collectively, Jew and Gentile together, being saved. And that final perfect picture at the end, which is the 12 tribes standing in heaven. Let's see what else we have.
Radically rejecting any conception that any Jew had ever had about membership in Israel.
Okay, so what is...
So he's saying that I'm radically rejecting... Hold on, let me see.
And not appreciating that in itself is an anti-Jewish, un-Jewish thing. Jewish exceptionalism is under attack in the New Testament. The Mosaic Law is under attack in the New Testament. Jewish
exceptionalism is not under attack in the New Testament at all, actually. Okay, Paul is not preaching a message of universal inclusion. This is the heart of what I teach, folks. But yet, Mr. Valliant is saying the opposite and saying that I teach universal inclusion. And Derek knows this, man. He's sitting there. I can see it all over his face. He knows that what I teach is not lining up with what Valliant is claiming. Okay, and that's why Shani and others in the comments here try to set him straight and say, look, no, that's not what he says. The fact of the matter is that I've never once taught universal inclusion since I came to IO. I've taught IO. That's why I'm IO. I'm Israel only. Because that includes the ones out in the nations. Okay, Paul's mission was clear. All Israel would be saved. That was his goal. That was the sum of all the parts. He stood before King Agrippa and he preached the hope of Israel. Nothing but the hope of Israel, the hope of the fathers. He preached and said that he was on trial because of what they worked for all their lives, hoping to attain, that being the age to come for the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, like Jesus said, in the age to come, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. It was all about them. So I've never taught this inclusion idea. And Valliant is pinning me against the Jews, saying that my universal inclusion idea goes directly against what the Jews believe about their being, the exception. They're the chosen ones. But I don't teach that. I teach what the Jews believe. I teach that this was Israel only. From cover to cover, it's Israel only. And I teach that everything that we see taking place in the New Testament was Israel only. And all those who we see coming in during that time frame were Israelites in one way or another. I may not be able to explain how they got where they were or how they got to this region or how they were in this geographical location. I don't care. I know what the mission was. I know what the goal was. I know what the story characters state. And I know what the final picture is. And that final picture is all Israel saved. So I don't need to know the fine details. There's plenty of meat and potatoes right there for me to grab onto to realize, hey, this is what this story is about.
Testament. So while on one hand, it says the Jewish God is the only God, a Hebrew prophecy is correct and must be fulfilled, this is indeed the fulfillment of Jewish law. On the other hand, it is altering Mosaic law. It is altering the conception of the Messiah. It is altering membership in the house of Israel.
It's not altering anything. It actually fits with history. Talk about altering the Mosaic law. What would alter the Mosaic law more than the temple being destroyed? Can anyone answer that? Nothing. Not a single solitary thing would alter the Mosaic law than that epicenter, to take the words from Valliant himself, being crumbled and destroyed and thrown to the ground. Because when that went bye-bye, so did every jot and tittle of the law, according to Jesus in Matthew 5, 17, and 18. And that's when heaven and earth passed away. Okay, every bit of that system, that temple system, the sacrifices, the altar, the genealogical records, the priesthood, every single bit of it went bye-bye. Okay, so talk about altering the Mosaic law. They weren't altering anything. Paul actually told them, we established the law. Do we neglect it? By no means. We uphold it. We establish it. But Paul, again, knew his audience. He knew he was dealing with the Jews who were practicing and non-Jews who were not practicing. And he had to appeal to both parties. His mission was simple. He wanted all Israel saved. Didn't matter if they were Jew. Didn't matter if they were Greek. Didn't matter where their lives had taken them. If they were Christ, it was because they were Abraham's seed and heirs according to promise. And that's what Paul's mission was. He was breaking down the barrier wall between the brethren. Very, very simple stuff here.
There were Jews working with the Romans in the first century for whom Christianity would have been extremely convenient. Not only would we have pacified a group of Messianic Jews who are still an ongoing problem. Jason seems to think that the first Jewish war destroyed the Jews.
That's false. I do think it destroyed them. It took all their power away, and that was the beginning of the end. And, of course, that ended their covenantal system with Yahweh. Yes, of course, that's clear. But I am very aware that it didn't do away with every single literal Jew or every, Jewish, zealot or whatever you want to call them, militant Jew on the face of the planet. Obviously, that's unrealistic.
And that the Romans are somehow caring about the Jews in diverting this religion of rebellion and violence into a peaceful mode. No, that serves Roman interests precisely. And everything about the ideology in the New Testament, everything about it, serves that interest exactly.
So everything about the New Testament serves Roman ideology, right? So Roman ideology is concerned with a remnant of Israel being saved and taken to heaven. Because that's what the New Testament is about, right? I can laugh about this because and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but it's kind of funny to me how he can say that this was created by Rome for some agenda and some purpose, yet the whole focus and goal of that entire New Testament is all Israel saved. It was the true remnant of Israel being taken to heaven and standing redeemed, clothed in white by the throne, singing the new salvation song. Man, Romans really cared about Israel's history, so much so that they created this unbelievably in-depth tale about their salvation.
Notice that Jesus does help out the Canaanite woman, despite the disciples saying, don't do it. He even praises her faith as being great, which doesn't suggest to me that she's not part of the elect.
Well, he called her a dog, and he compared her to the children. So, again, if you're going to hold the concept of elect and God predestining and knowing and foreknowing and knowing everything prior, then she is not one of the elect. Because if you're going to say that her faith made her one of the elect, then by necessity you can't hold to the doctrine of predestination. Because if the doctrine of predestination is true, then Christ already knew his sheep and his sheep would come. And he called her a dog. She wasn't one of the sheep.
Quite the opposite. There's nothing in that section that says she's out. No, in fact, Jesus is simply limiting the scope.
There's nothing at all that says she's in. That's the key.
Scope of his mission. He only came. In fact, that seems to understand.
So you see what he did? He said he's limiting the scope of his mission. He only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So I don't understand what he's trying to do there, but he's got to do something with Matthew 15:24. I mean, a lot of people do. They try to get rid of that. But that's obviously a thorn in the side for anyone who tries to say that this New Testament is about anyone other than Israel. I mean, why would that be in there? But let's listen to what he said again. I just want to see if I can try to understand how he tries to rationalize this. We'll go back about 10 seconds.
The opposite. There's nothing in that section that says she's out.
Here we go.
In fact, Jesus is simply limiting the scope of his mission. He only came. In fact, that seems to understand what Paul said. I was the apostle to the Gentiles.
He only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? That's his argument. He only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I still don't understand it. To me, it still seems like he's only coming for Israel, right? There's no, you can't interpret that any other way. Then he goes on and says, he relates that to Paul saying, I was the apostle to the Gentiles. Yet here we have Paul standing in front of King Agrippa saying that he preaches nothing but the hope of Israel. And he's standing on trial for the hope that the hope of the 12 tribes. He says in Acts chapter 13, God raised up for Israel a Savior, Jesus. He says in Galatians 4, that Christ died for those under the law. That's Israel. Right? So you have all these things. You have him in Romans 11 showing his heart, all Israel saved. Right? So yes, he was the apostle to the Gentiles. Sure, he was the apostle to the nations. There is no word Gentile. He was the apostle to the nations for the purpose of gathering in Israel. And when the fullness of those nations came in, meaning when the full number of elect sheep that were living in those nations came in, the result of it was all Israel saved. So we have to really understand this. Just because Paul says he's the apostle to the Gentiles doesn't prove anything. It certainly doesn't disprove his ultimate goal, which was all Israel saved. He was the apostle to the nations, yes, to the non-practicing. And he also dealt with the practicing Jews too. But he sort of categorizes himself as sort of the guy who was going to handle the nations, if you will. And that was going to result in all Israel saved. That's really all it's saying. Let's continue here.
All the goals of Rome, all the aims and purposes that Rome had in mind here are being accomplished. And Jason doesn't seem to realize that the purpose of it is simply being accomplished with the message of peace, turn the other cheek, and so forth.
So this entire in-depth, intricate, fine-detailed, deep story with names of people and places and all Israel saved, and this group of Israelites who overcome and persevere through the Great Tribulation and end up standing in heaven. That entire story was created by Rome for peace. It was all about peace. Folks, come on. What planet were we born on? Did we wake up, were we born yesterday? I mean, this isn't really convincing. Okay, so I don't understand how anybody could be convinced of this. The peace argument, to me, is totally, it's just not even relevant to what we're seeing taking place in the New Testament. The New Testament is about the salvation of Israel, period. It has nothing to do with universal peace or some agenda to cause peace throughout the Roman Empire. It's about the salvation of Israel. It's about a mission to gather in all the elect.
Okay, so it seems, if I could just add one more thing.
Yeah.
Jason recognizes that the centurion whom Jesus praises in the Synoptic Gospels is not Israel.
Correct.
He seems to accept the idea that, that guy could be fully Gentile. That guy could be non-Torah adherent.
Correct. Yeah, that guy is not, there's nothing in the narrative would get me to believe that guy was forgiven of trespasses of the law, right? Because that's obviously why Jesus died. He died for sins committed under the law. He died for those under the law. He was born into the law to redeem those under the law. He died for sins committed under the covenant. So unless he can prove that Roman centurion was under Israel's Mosaic law, then I don't see him as being part of the story. I see that as a side detail, okay, outside of the main narrative.
And yet his faith exceeds that of any Israelite.
Correct. Jesus was simply making a point. He was speaking in sort of hyperbole, like almost exaggeration, like, wow, look at this, a Roman. His faith exceeds my own people, something along those lines. But it's nothing to really read into as if this guy was going to have an inheritance with the 12 tribes of Israel and be standing there with them at the end.
Now, it doesn't go on to discuss how Jesus directly says that many nations will sit at the table with Abraham.
Oh, yes, I do, actually. I have many, I just didn't in the audio, but I have many teachings on this. In fact, I have one specifically on that passage. That's nothing more than Paul saying when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, all Israel will be saved, is it not? Jesus says many people will come from the north, south, east, and west and sit at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Well, again, the promise was to Abraham's seed, right? And that's Israel. Well, Israel scattered all abroad, and when the fullness of the nations came in, all Israel would be saved. So who do you think the fullness of the nations is that's coming in, resulting in all Israel saved? Well, it's the many from the north, south, east, and west. Okay, no matter what, you still can't get beyond the conclusion and the end of the story, which is when all this would be wrapped up, when all the elect would be saved and the gospel would end, which had to be completed by the end, which was in that generation, by the way. Of course, we know the great multitude from Revelation 7, right? This great multitude, which is the 12 tribes again, just worded a little differently. Okay, this great multitude is shown standing in heaven, clothed in white, saying salvation belongs to our God, crying out with palm branches, of course. The 12 tribes were the only one who could sing the salvation song, so we know it's them. And this fulfills the promise that in Abraham's seed many nations would be blessed, or all nations would be blessed. That's exactly the fulfillment of that, because Israel came back from all nations, all peoples, all tribes and tongues. Right? But the interesting thing is at the bottom of Revelation 7, at the end, we see where they came out from, that great multitude. And that great multitude from all nations came out from the Great Tribulation and had washed their robes in white. Well, when was the only Great Tribulation? Here's a hint. Jesus tells his disciples that they must go through much tribulation. That they would go through much tribulation, a time of persecution and tribulation unlike they'd ever seen before. Peter says we must go through much tribulation before we enter the kingdom of God in the book of Acts. So these ones in the great multitude of Revelation 7 came out from that last day's great tribulation period. Again, showing that the many who come from the north, south, east, and west were relative and related to and fit nicely tucked within that last days period where the gospel was going out to all nations before the end, and the fullness of those nations would come in. That's exactly what Jesus spoke of.
The Israelites themselves will have much gnashing of teeth, but he does admit that Jesus the centurion is a Gentile.
Well, yeah, I mean, and then what do you mean by Gentile? We got to get him on the show, but because that's a big one. I mean, I've ran into this, James. I'm just saying. Now, I wanna pause for a second here because I think it's important to recognize that he is a absolutely brilliant guy, and I don't want this to come across because you're like he doesn't recognize. I think the problem isn't that he can't recognize. He can, but we're starting on two different areas, and so like for me, I came to full preterism as a believer. Okay, and the reason why we full preterists came to this conclusion is because we had to make reconciliation with the time statements and the context of Scripture. We had to make it fulfilled because he said it. Is he lying? Is the New Testament telling the truth, or is he lying? And so, we're reconciling these things. And so when you come from a full preterist perspective, everything has this there is a first century imminent fulfillment. And there's debates within the full preterist camp, and there's 1,000,001 full preterist types out there. Everything from, did Jesus ascend in his physical body? Did he cast off his physical body, and now he's like a phantom type ghost, and you're somewhat of a Doecitist? Are you, what the hell's going on with Jesus? And so we went through all these things, and they're trying to be as conservative as possible, and then you come to a dating of the New Testament, and you're like, well, everything's written before the destruction of the temple, because everything gives hints, it seems, of an imminent disaster, and we know the disaster that happens in 70 AD, et cetera, et cetera. So we know now, scholars are saying, did this stuff this later, especially the epistles.
Well, if we treat it in a scientific way, we have to say that prophecies are generally written after the event in order to precisely conform to the event so that they can give a captain retrospect view, a captain forethought view of what happened. Scholars have recognized that not only would it be a miraculous prediction of the temple's destruction on Jesus' part, but that the details Jesus gives, the armies in the clouds and so forth, and all the other details really, the false messiahs who were violent rebels, and all the other aspects of his description conformed so nicely to what the details were at the time that it could not have been written prior. The Gospels were clearly written afterwards.
Well, again, this is a sort of a moot point, I guess, because he's going to believe that that none of this is supernatural and that the story is completely, it's just a myth of sorts. Whereas I'm not fully there. I'm open to that idea, but I believe that the story is very cohesive. So he's saying, that scholars now say that the story and all these books are written after. I can still cite numerous scholars that say the story was written before. Okay, so you have, and actually probably more scholars, actually I know for a fact, more scholars believe that the epistles and the letters were written before than after. So much more would side with the traditional view, not just in Christianity either, because I know that that's an argument like, well, sure, they're Christian. No, but even some of the secular scholars would believe that they were earlier dated. But in reality, nobody's ever going to be able to prove that concretely, right? And I've said this before, it's kind of a dumb argument because I can sit here and say, oh, that book was written in 200 AD, and this guy can sit there and say, no, that book was written in 50 AD. And at the end of the day, neither one of them will ever come to any concrete conclusion on it. There will never be any evidence that can prove that. Okay, so it's just hearsay and conspiracy and assumption at best. So what I'm saying is that the story makes a lot of sense. Okay, and yes, Jesus's predictions do kind of line up to the T. In fact, some of the Romans, like Tacitus and some of the historians, do record the same things taking place, supernatural type things that took place in the sky and at the temple during those days, during those end days. And I'm sure that Valliant would kind of toss that off to, well, sure they did. They made up the story. Excuse me. But see, I don't look at it with such I don't look at everything as a conspiracy, right? I look at it from what the story says first, and then I make my conclusions. And to me, the story is impossible to be anything other than a salvation story of Israel. Now, could it be that maybe this story was written after the fact by Israelites or by Jews as sort of a heroic tale of sorts, or maybe something that they hoped would take place. So they created this sort of mythological tale of what took place during those days when the temple fell, and they created this elaborate story. It could be. It seems unlikely, but it could be. But I mean, we have real written letters written to real people, right? I mean, what other document in all of antiquity can we point to that resembles this, right? And we're going to get to a point here soon where Valliant mentions an argument that I brought up about how there's no other proof that the Romans ever did anything remotely close to this in their history, right? Where they destroy a people and then create a story about that people's salvation. They never did anything like it. And he refers to the Aeneid by Virgil, the poem, right? It's a literal poem that rhymes. And he says that this is similar to the Bible. And folks, I mean, this is why you can't believe everything you hear. You have to investigate and look at it, because when you look at the Aeneid, the poem from Virgil, you can see that it is absolutely nothing like the Bible. Nothing at all. It's not even on the same planet. It's not even in the same galaxy, folks. Okay? So it has nothing to do with the Bible. It looks nothing like the Bible. And there's no relation that can be drawn from it. The bottom line and the fact remains that the Romans never did anything like what Valliant claims. They never destroyed a people and then created an elaborate tale about that people's salvation and how a remnant of the people they just destroyed overcame the persecution and the destruction that they brought on to the people. And this remnant overcame that persecution and ended up in heaven standing victoriously and exalted. Give me a break. They never did anything of the sort. And he has no sources, so he had to quote and point to the Aeneid, or if that's how you pronounce it, but it really is stupid. And I'm going to read that. He's not stupid. Let me make sure he understands that. But the comparison was stupid. I have to call it what it is. And I'll read some of that to you in a bit so you can see exactly what I mean. Okay, but again, the point is that this doesn't really make any sense if it was written by the Romans, right? We have letters, folks, letters written to real people. Show me another work done by the Romans where they write letters and name real people and talk all about Israel. It's all about Israel, right? And everything's cohesive. Everything works, this is the thing. In their view, in Valliant's view, there's a bunch of, contradictions in the New Testament. Things don't add up. On one hand, you got Paul telling certain individuals not to be circumcised. Over here, you got him saying, we uphold the law, right? He's looking at this as contradictions. But to me, I can see it as the big picture, right? I see the big picture. I see what Paul's doing. I see the end goal and the sum of all the parts, which was all Israel saved. And I say to myself, holy cow, this makes sense, right? This is one cohesive story from front to cover, from front cover to back cover. So I don't see it as a bunch of contradictions. I don't see it as not making sense. I don't see it as Roman propaganda. I don't see it as an agenda for Rome. I see it as a beautiful story about Israel's God, Yahweh, and how he saved them at the end. Okay, and now, again, I'm not saying it's true. This isn't me saying that this actually happened. It could very well be a mythological story. But if I am going to go the direction of myth, I'm certainly going to go in the direction that it was written by someone who was very fond of the idea of Israel being saved, and someone who probably had a heart for his own people, right? And wanted to see something like this take place, and maybe had hopes of a Messiah, so maybe invented his own Messiah. Who knows what really happened? But it certainly is not believable to think that the Romans created this story based upon what the story actually says.
Judaism or in the New Testament to believe in just one glorious second coming, or third coming, or fourth. In fact, many preterists don't believe in a final end of times, and that everything wrapped up in a physical way in the first century. Well, as I say, there's nothing even in the New Testament that suggests that there can't be more than one messianic arrival. And if there is a final judgment implied in the New Testament, that's okay with us too. Jason spends a great deal of his time wasting his time. Like I say, I don't want to make this come off in any way, because he does seem like a really honest and open guy to all this.
He is.
But I want to point out to him that not only was most of Christian literature written after the time he claims the religion has folded,
That's his opinion and his niche group's opinion. That is not the opinion of all scholars, not even by a long shot.
Closed, finished, done with.
Right.
Why would people be writing the Gospels? Why would people be writing Christian literature? Why would people have any interest in this subject at all if there wasn't an ongoing mission of salvation?
Well, first of all, the story is likely probably myth, right? Because at the end, what's the final picture? It's Israel floating up into heaven being saved. So to me, it's not that far-fetched to think about let's say Valliant is right and that these books and letters and everything were written long after the destruction of Jerusalem, right? It doesn't seem too far-fetched to think that there could have been an Israelite or a Jew or a group of them who wrote this story about their own people, right? And who created this sort of tale, right? Who knows? They could have been, they could have had their own, group where they wrote things and created this tale. It doesn't seem that far-fetched to consider, right? It certainly seems more believable than to think that the Romans would do something like this. I mean, this is totally out of the norm for the Romans to do, which is why Valliant couldn't give us any other examples, so he had to point to Virgil's poem. But it just doesn't make any sense to me.
An ongoing religion. And here's where we really disagree. Jason believes it's been closed up, that the religion came to a termination in 70 AD, and there is really nothing to say that there's a termination in 70 AD, or that there might be subsequent messianic arrivals.
Yes, actually there is. Okay, let him go a little further.
After 70 AD. Mm-hmm. So while I agree with him that modern Christians are wrong when it comes to understanding the Jesus apocalypse as predicting a first century Messiah, it did. I'm with contemporary Christians, however, when they say, wait a minute, the final judgment may be something completely different and after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem.
So, in other words, he's with the futurists in that there's a future judgment, right? Now, let me read. So, this is one of his main arguments in this whole entire point, in this whole entire chat here, is that I would need to prove that there's one end in Scripture, that there's one final end in the New Testament, and that there cannot be multiple messianic comings in the New Testament, right? And that's the easiest thing to prove, right? I mean, that's so simple, right? I mean, that's all I prove. But this one guy, Spencer, I don't know who he is, but he commented and he says, it's really interesting to see, he said, good chat, guys. It's really interesting to see how scholars like Valliant, Price, and others interact with preterism once introduced to it. But I think they often shortchange themselves by not having a really thorough grasp of it. It's clear in this conversation that Valliant often conflates Israel-only preterism with full preterism in general, and I can see this causing issues. I also can't get on board with some of what Valliant says regarding the possibility of more than one messianic coming, amen to that, or that the early church fathers couldn't have gotten it all wrong. Those of us from a full preterist background know those talking points very well because they come straight from Orthodox futurist Christianity. The New Testament may be a strange patchwork full of inconsistencies, which I disagree with because it's very consistent, but one remarkably consistent theme throughout the entire thing, from the Gospels to the Epistles, is that there would be one eschatological event at which time the parousia, resurrection, judgment, and destruction of Old Covenant Judaism, as symbolized by the temple, would occur. Until scholars like Valliant get this important concept, the pieces of the puzzle are going to remain difficult to put together. They don't even realize that they are still operating within the orthodox eschatological framework provided to them by Christianity. The question of the dating of the New Testament texts and the motives behind their creation would be much closer to being answered if the full preterist concept of New Testament eschatology were understood and accepted by secular scholars instead of the orthodox futurist nonsense. That's an incredibly good comment by this Spencer guy, right? And the thing is that he's right. Valliant's approaching this from a confused, futuristic type Christian concept or Christian, perspective, right? He really does not understand preterism. He doesn't understand the Bible. That's what me and Mike Barris were talking about the other day. It's like, and Mike agrees. He's like, I've talked with Valliant. He's a good guy. He has nothing against him, but he really doesn't know his Bible. That's the thing. If you're going to write a book about the Bible, if you're going to teach about the Bible and come up with a theory about the Bible, then you need to know the Bible, right? He doesn't know the Bible, right? I would go to war against anybody when it comes to actually knowing what the New Testament says and being able to put it in its place and cohesively tie it all together smoothly so that it makes sense. That's what I specialize in. And, with all due respect to Mr. Valliant, it doesn't look like he puts a lot of emphasis on that. So if you don't know the Bible, then you're not going to understand the story. And if you don't understand the story, you're not going to understand how everything culminated and wrapped up at the final destruction of Jerusalem, which was the end. Okay, Jesus said his coming would take place in that generation. It coincided with the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, that was the time when all things would be fulfilled. That was the time when the resurrection, the judgment, the saints would inherit the kingdom. It all came to an end. Okay, now you can look at my old work, okay, although I'm more on the Israel-only stuff on my channel, but go to Don Preston's page. I mean, even though the guy is completely confused as to his identity and that he's not some spiritual wacky Israelite, he does a great job explaining how everything culminated and coincided with the destruction of the temple. I mean, everything. It's all right there. There's a million scriptural reasons why. And that's why guys like me and Derek came to full preterism, because it's plain as day. It's right in our face. But Valliant hasn't put the time in, obviously, to really see these things. So he's still approaching it from a futuristic, multiple messianic coming, future judgment, future resurrection type, nonsense. When all you see in those last days writings is that the resurrection, the judgment, everything was at hand, about to take place. They were in the last days. There's no multiple last days. There's no multiple end times in Scripture. There's one. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand, was the words out of John the Baptist and the words out of Jesus, because they had entered into that last period before the end. And the gospel had to go to all nations before that end would come. Now, Valliant goes on to say things about how the burden's on me to prove that this ends. And that's sort of like he hangs his hat on that point here. And that's not a very good point for him to hang his hat on, because that's something that I can prove very easily. Very easily. Okay, and I can, maybe what I'll do is I'll do another separate audio in the future about all the passages that show the end. But for now, all you have to do is really think on just a few. Right, Matthew 24:14, Jesus said this gospel will go to all nations, and then the end will come. The end. There's only one end. Okay? That end was encapsulated in this generation, just a few verses later, by the same guy, Jesus. Jesus said he'd come for them before some standing there died. That's his coming for his saints. That's when all Israel would be saved. That's when they would put on immortality. That's when all those who were Christ would be raised at his coming, and then comes the end. The end. I don't know how much clearer Paul could get. Paul didn't say at the coming of Christ, then begins things, then comes a new religion. No, he said then comes the end, when the kingdom is given to God. Okay, so that was the end. Jesus said in John 6, all those were his would be raised at his coming, and he would be raised at the end, and he would not lose one. Well, that's the same end he encapsulated in that generation. Revelation 7 shows the great multitude, which was the 12 tribes, because obviously they're singing the salvation song, and only the 12 tribes could sing that. And guess where they came out from? They came out from the Great Tribulation period, which was that period that was in the last days. That was why they were going through the tribulation. Through much tribulation we must enter the kingdom of God, Peter said. To them, not us. So there's only one period in the Bible that is the last days. Okay, there's no future last days. Valliant's going right back into futurism here. Right? I mean, he's saying that there's no audience relevance for the people to whom these things were spoken to. But yet there is, because it's all right there, and everything is perfectly in line with the destruction of the temple, which was the end of the age, which was when heaven and earth passed away. And Jesus worded it as that was going to be his coming. And it was sort of like a twofold kind of coming, right? His coming would be to put an end to the system, right? To put an end to the curse and to get rid of the temple and do away with the age. But at the same token, that coming would serve to call his saints up into the clouds where they would forever be with him. And he said in that age to come, they would never die, they would be like angels, and they would never marry anymore. Okay, so that's the whole point, is that it was a coming for his saints. Like Hebrews says, he will appear again a second time apart from sin for salvation for those who eagerly wait for him. That's what was at hand. So again, the argument he hangs his hat on, mostly in this audio, is that I can't prove that there's only one coming and there's only one end in the New Testament. Well, yes, I can, and that's all I do. And if he wants to invest a little time, maybe he will. He can go back and listen to some of my teachings, and I do that over and over and over again. It's a broken record at this point. And so that argument is not an argument, and that's not something that he would want to get into, because I could probably, if I really wanted to, I could probably tie together 300 New Testament passages, maybe more, that show that everything came to its completion and fulfillment at the destruction of Jerusalem, which was the coming of the Lord. And I can show how all the elect were going to be raised at that time, and then came the end, which means that this new religion that he thinks was created ended at the coming. Because if you don't have the gospel, and you don't have salvation, and you don't have the Holy Spirit, then you don't have a new religion. And as Paul said in Ephesians 1:14, the Holy Spirit was the guarantee of their inheritance until the redemption of the purchased possession, which was Jacob. That's Israel. So the Holy Spirit was given as a deposit, like a down payment, if you will, which would carry them until they received their promise, which was the age to come, which was immortality and that angelic heavenly body that they were waiting for, that Christ received first. So I'm already approaching 3 hours here. I'm going to just touch on a couple quick things here, and you guys can listen to the last 30 minutes of this presentation of his if you'd like. I'll put the link in the comments for you to look at. One of his arguments, like I said, I had made the argument that the Romans never did anything like this, right? Like, can he show me anything that looks remotely close to the Bible, and that would resemble the Romans slaughtering a people and then writing a story about a people that exalts that people and shows a remnant of that people being saved and taken to heaven. And so he quotes the Aeneid from Virgil. Well, you can look it up online if you'd like. There's a few books, but I'll read book number 1 to you, called Arms and the Man I Sing. And it's kind of long. I'll see if I can breeze through it. But you tell me if this looks like the New Testament in any way, okay? Any way, shape, or form. It reads like this: Arms and the man I sing, who, forced by fate, and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore. Long labors, both by sea and land, he bore. And in the doubtful war, before he won the Latin realm and built the destined town, his banished gods restored to rights divine, and settled sure succession in his line. From whence the race of Alban fathers come, and the long glories of majestic Rome. O Muse, the causes and the crimes relate, what goddess was provoked, and whence her hate? For what offense the queen of heaven began to persecute so brave, so just a man? Involved his anxious life in endless cares, exposed to wants and hurried into wars, can heavenly minds such high resentment show, or exercise their spite in human woe? Against the Tiber's mouth, but far away, an ancient town was seated on the sea, a Tyrian colony the people made, stout for the war and studious of their trade. Carthage the name, beloved by Juno more than her own Argos, or the Samian shore. Here stood her chariot, here, if heaven were kind, the seat of awful empire she designed. Yet she had heard an ancient rumor fly, long cited by the people of the sky, that times to come should see the Trojan race her Carthage ruin and her towers deface. Nor thus confined the yoke of sovereign sway should on the necks of all the nations lay. She pondered this and feared it was in fate, nor could forget the war she waged of late, for conquering Greece against the Trojan state. Besides, long causes working in her mind, and secret seeds of envy lay behind. Deep graven in her heart the doom remained of partial Paris, and her form disdained the grace bestowed on ravished Ganymede, Electra's glories, and her injured bed. Each was a cause alone, and all combined to kindle vengeance in her haughty mind. For this, far distant from the Latian coast, she drove the remnants of the Trojan host. All right, now I'm going to stop there. That's only about halfway. I'm not going to keep reading it. But folks, let me ask you a real easy question. Does that sound like anything the New Testament says? I mean, we're looking at a poem here, folks. Okay, a poem. And this is what Valliant refers to when he tries to say, look, the Romans did things like this before. This looks nothing like the Bible. It's not even on the same planet. It's not even in the same galaxy. Okay, it's a lame attempt, sorry to say, but it is a lame attempt to try to throw something out there to sort of pacify that argument, because it's a strong one. Because the Romans had never done anything like Valliant claims. And they never did anything after that like Valliant claims. Valliant claims that the Romans had a one-time deal where they created this extremely extravagant, elaborate, fine, detailed tale of the Israelites and how they exalt Israel up into heaven in a victorious state after they had just got done slaughtering them. They write this story. They invest all this effort and energy into creating a story to so-called pacify militant Jews, who most of them were already slaughtered anyway. There were only small groups of them, right? And so he writes. He wants you to believe that the Romans did this, but the Romans never did this, and that's why this was the best example he could come up with. So if you want to look at it, Google it. It's called the Aeneid. It's Aeneid, and it's written by Virgil. And there's I don't know how many books, but there's at least 6 or 7, maybe more. And they're all like this. They're all just poems, right? And they're kind of stupid. They don't really make any sense. They jump around. They're very vivid. It's nothing like the Bible. It's not a letter written to real people. It's not a letter written about real events that they were going through. Okay, it's not an account of what people do, a detailed account like the Gospels. It's not like the book of Hebrews, which talks about Israel's old priesthood and old law system, comparing it to Christ and how he did away with that for them. It's nothing like that. It's not even like the book of Revelation, which is a vivid, symbolic, imagery type story filled with Jewish, literature and Jewish references. Okay, it's on its own island. It looks nothing like the Bible. So that's not a real good example. And then the last thing I wanted to say was just this argument that Valliant makes at some point in the last half hour about how, if my view is correct, then the Messiah has never come to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And most of you have listened to the last audio I made, which I titled Chaos. There's a picture of chaos on the screen, and I think I titled it Stop Butchering the Old Testament, because that's exactly what Valliant does here. He says, well, if DaCosta's view is correct, then that means that the Messiah has never come to rule the nations with a rod of iron. But see, Valliant makes the same mistake that many futurists make. And he makes the same mistake that the confused Jews make as well, as they're looking for a Messiah that's never going to come for them. They're looking at passages like Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 9, which says, unto us a child is born, the government shall be upon his shoulder. Isaiah 11, he will rule with justice and zeal and fervor, and he won't judge by his eyes, but he'll judge by the law, and he'll have the Spirit of God upon him and all this. And they're looking at all these things, but all these passages are only about figures in Israel's history, right? Isaiah wrote about things that were going on in his day. Okay, and this is all about Zerubbabel. Zerah, the seed in Hebrew, Babel of Babylon, the seed of Babylon, the one born in Babylon. Unto us a child is born. Zerubbabel was born in Babylon during the Babylonian captivity, and he led his people out of Babylon. He led them back to Israel, and the government was upon his shoulders. He was the governor of Israel. He ruled with justice. He loved God's law. He brought it back. He was very instrumental in reestablishing the Torah. He laid the foundation for the new temple. This guy had a hard-on for God's law. Okay, and he was the one who ruled the people with a rod of iron. Now, Valliant forgets that the word there is goyim, or goy, which simply means nations, people, right? It many times in the Old Testament simply just means people. And when you understand that, a lot of the times the word people fits a lot better. It really changes the dynamic of what could be said, right? Think about it. He will rule the nations with a rod of iron, or he will rule the people with a rod of iron. Interesting. Because remember, unto us a child is born. Well, who's the us? It's Israel. So to me, it makes more sense that this one was going to rule the people with a rod of iron and have a heart for God's law. And that's exactly what he did. He was called the signet ring by Haggai, which means the very representative of God on earth. He was the spitting image of God on earth. Okay, that's what a signet ring is. He was the chosen one, said Haggai. Okay, and there's a lot more about him. And I linked, if you look at my last audio, I linked an older video that I did on that. on Isaiah 9, how that's not at all about the Messiah, but it's about Zerubbabel. So Valliant makes the same mistake that many Christians make when they apply these sort of cliche, Christian passages like "rule the nations with a rod of iron" and these things. And he says, "Oh well, if DeCosta's view is right, that means that this never happened because clearly in AD 70 the Messiah never ruled any nations with rods of iron." Well, again, the original context is all about that ancient time. And if you just look down in Isaiah 11 at what's going to happen by this leader, this "unto us a child is born," right? The details, the contextual details show very clearly that it's all about that ancient time, Isaiah's time, the return from Babylon, when certain places actually existed. If you look at Isaiah 11, you see that Edom, Moab, the Philistines, Ammon, all these places are still in existence, and they're all getting the shit kicked out of them by this, or at the same time that this "unto us a child is born" dude comes along. Right? So Edom, Moab, Ammon, what's the other one? The Philistines. Are these all just going to appear in the future? Are they going to come back to exist? Because they would have to in order for Isaiah 11 to be relevant in the future, because they were all related to that root of Jesse, that seed of David who was going to come. And yes, Zerubbabel was from the lineage of David. So just a lot of confusion there. And it's I don't blame him because we've all been there, right? I mean, he was a Christian, according to what I remember him saying. We all come from a background of confusion, and it just requires some digging to get out of and to place things properly. But again, I just don't think Valliant understands the Bible well enough to really discuss it in a way that he would see that creating Christ cannot be so. Me, on the other hand, I've invested countless weeks, months, years into studying this Bible, unbiasedly, by the way, with no bias whatsoever. Just wanted to get to the facts, get to the truth. And here I am, 8 years later, saying, wow, this thing's Israel only, and it had nothing to do with me all along. And it's quite freeing. It's a nice feeling to come out of it, to come out of the delusion and just enjoy life and realize that this is probably just a tale. And who knows if it even happened. Most likely probably didn't because of the way it ends. But I just think that we're on two different playing fields, him and I. I think we're on two different wavelengths, two different planets, two different galaxies. I think that we can't really have a intelligent or productive conversation because he's approaching it from a conspiracy angle. I'm approaching it from it makes sense angle. It's a cohesive story angle. And we're just not going to ever get on that same page. So to me, it's kind of tough to even address some of these points because he's so far away from where I am in his understanding and his view that it's almost better off, hey, do what you got to do, believe what you want to believe, and I'll do the same, right? I'm not going to bash the guy over what he believes, right? I save my bashing for the wannabes. That's where I get my jollies off. Right, that's what I enjoy, because they're the hateful ones, right? They're the ones who are always telling you you're a heretic, you're going to hell, you're Satan, blah blah blah. Like, this is the stuff I get on a daily basis in the comments of my YouTube channel. So to me, I have a bone to pick with them. I don't have a bone to pick with Valliant. I don't have a bone to pick with the Creating Christ guys. Do I like idiots like Jeff Bricks? I used to. Now I don't, because he's a buffoon. But I don't have a bone to pick with most of these guys. They're all pretty good guys for the most part. So, with all this said, this will most likely be my last reply. I may come back later and do more little teachings on it. And if I come across something that I think is worthy of mentioning, you might hear it pop back up again in passing. But I can't really see myself doing much devoted to it anymore. Because, again, I'd rather focus my energy and time on disproving the main view, which has duped and deceived people for hundreds of years, that being Christianity, rather than invest my time in a small niche group that not many people even believe in, called Creating Christ, right? And I don't think that view will ever take off. Just like I don't think Israel only will ever take off for obvious reasons. It cuts people out. But I think the Creating Christ view is so radically tough to believe. It's a conspiracy theory, right? And people, you gotta have a certain mind for a conspiracy, right? I mean, I like conspiracies too, right? Like I'm into them. Trust me. Like Sandy Hook Elementary School, 9/11, like all that stuff. Like, yeah, I watch those things, right? Because I want to see the evidence and the facts, and I want to see how it looks compared to what actually happened. And who knows? Some of those things could be true. But this particular conspiracy theory, I just can't get on board with because I know what the Bible says. And I just cannot reconcile the two. So anyways, folks, I'm at 2 hours, 49 minutes, 48 seconds. And unfortunately, I came up about, 35 minutes shy of finishing his audio presentation. But I did kind of bump ahead and address his ending points for the most part. I'm sure there's little things I didn't address. I hope I didn't misrepresent him. I know he did misrepresent me, and I brought that to your attention. I do not believe in a universal salvation message. I believe in Israel only, and I've been very verbal about that, and everybody who follows me knows that. So that is not true, and I'm actually in line with what the Jews believe it or not. So that's about all I got, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm exhausted. My throat hurts. And I'm going to watch this Raptors-Bucks Game 5 NBA playoff game. And we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.